Chapter 877. At this moment, on Mount Shu, there was already a gloomy atmosphere. On the sword peak controlled by the Moonsword lineage, there were no visible injuries on the face of the Moonsword Lord. Only the feminine sharpness was not as dazzling as before. He was injured by Xiao Yan and Zen Master Dade. Even with the protection of the falling stone sword intent, his void return Dharma body was still damaged, and it would take a long time to recover. But at this moment, he still needed to use the Moonsword Lord to help the Shaozi Sword Lord and Guanchong Sword Lord to heal their primordial spirits. Of these two, one had his void return Dharma body shattered by Shi Tianhao, and the other almost died under Xiao Yan's palm. Both of them were seriously injured. Compared to their own injuries, these great sword cultivators were even more depressed at the moment. The disciples were still hidden from them, but they had already received the news from Xian Longsheng that the master of the celestial sect had returned to Jade Jing Mountain and wiped out the Xian Annihilation Coalition. Su Anda of the Underworld Hall, Xiao Dongtian of the Eastern Heaven Gate, and Zhang and Rui of the Reincarnation Sect were all captured, and their Shushan Grand Elder, Xie Luosher, was killed by Lin Feng on the spot. The Celestial Dipper Sword Lord was nearby, but he was stopped by Lin Feng and could only watch him kill. This news was like a bolt from the blue, making Guanchong Sword Lord and the others dizzy. In addition, the Shaoshang Sword Lord and Li Xiong Sword Lord, who were responsible for intercepting the Northern Militant Royal Court, were also captured by Lin Feng. This was another piece of bad news. Opposite the Moon Sword Lord sat a middle-aged man with a square face. He was the Xiaoyang Sword Lord who had never left the mountain. Even though the Xiaoyang Sword Lord had always been calm, he felt depressed at this moment. His usually calm state of mind was fluctuating violently at this moment. This great sword cultivator, who was faintly the #1 Grandmaster of the 6 lineage's Sword Master, actually didn't dare to face his own junior disciples. The Moon Sword Lord, Guanchong Sword Lord, and Shaozi Sword Lord returned with serious injuries one after another. Although the news did not spread on a large scale, it still caused a fierce shock in Mount Shu. Originally, they were all waiting for news from the stone, hoping that the stone would succeed. After all, the master of the Celestial Sect of Wonders was not there. The stone had also brought the sect returning scabbard over, so it should be able to retrieve the heaven-punishing sword. Who would have thought that the person who was removing the falling rocks would not come back, but the news of his death? While Sword Venerable Xiaoyang and the others were shocked and furious, they also felt a sense of disappointment. Ever since the confrontation with Xianmen Tianzong, Shu Mountain had never gained the upper hand. On the contrary, they had suffered heavy losses. The Grand Yin Sword Sovereign gritted his teeth and said, "The sect master has already made an exception and brought the immortal heaven sword out of seclusion to meet up with Elder Tiangang. This time, even if we have to pay a price, we must kill the master of the Celestial Gate. We must avenge Elder Jie and our injuries." Shaozi Sword Lord's face was gloomy and he did not speak. Guanchong Sword Lord was the most seriously injured. Even after treatment, he was barely hanging on to his last breath. Hearing Sword Venerable Xiaoyang's words, his wooden eyes flickered with a cold light. Sword Venerable Xiaoyang said in a low voice, "Since this fiend has returned, his Yujing Mountain has also regained the ability to escape into the void. Elder Tiangang and the sect master together may be able to defeat him, but it is still not enough to kill this fiend. We must force him into a situation where he cannot escape, set up an inescapable net, and kill him." As Sword Venerable Xiaoyang spoke, he suddenly had a thought. Earlier than him, Sword Venerable Xiaoyang had left the Great Hall at the top of the Moonsword Peak. Looking down the mountain, he saw a young man in purple leisurely strolling through the mountains of western Shu. His expression was relaxed, and he was even leisurely looking at the scenery around him as if he was on an outing. But this person's appearance was unforgettable in the hearts of everyone in Shushan. It was the sect master of Xianmen, Lin Feng. There was an auspicious cloud above Lin Feng's head. The yin-yang life and death formation glowed brightly, as if it had manifested a real world. This world was filled with sword qi, shuttling back and forth. And above the yin-yang life and death formation, a sea of purple clouds rolled, and a white jade immortal mountain was faintly discernible. In the sky above the peak of Shushan, the canopy opened, revealing the distant galaxy. A huge figure appeared above Shushan. It was Sword Venerable Tiangang. The tip of his sword was firmly locked on to Lin Feng before him. In the great hall at the main peak of Shushan, Sword Venerable Firmament's face was as dark as still water. He was also staring at Lin Feng, who was strolling leisurely down the mountain. This time Lin Feng did not hide his aura. He fully unleashed his vast spiritual power, and the entire Shushan was shaking. The cultivators of Shushan's sword sect discovered Lin Feng one after another. Those with higher cultivation and status who knew about the Xian extermination battle all felt their hearts sink. Since Lin Feng was here, it meant that the Xian extermination coalition army had failed to attack the mountain. And some Shushan sword cultivators who did not know the truth were furious. How dare he come to our mountain gate? Does Xianmen Tianzong really think that he is above Shushan? This demon is too arrogant. He will definitely follow in the footsteps of the Blood River Man and the primordial Taotai. He will be killed by the great immortal heaven sword formation and the immortal heaven sword. Patriarch above, this demon must be killed. Sword Venerable Firmament trembled with anger. This person is boundlessly arrogant. Sword Venerable Firmament's son narrowed his eyes. This is the first time that Shushan has been attacked since it entered the modern era. It can be called the first major tribulation since the modern era. But as long as we survive this tribulation, Shushan will definitely be able to reach a higher level. Sword Venerable Firmament's son stared at Lin Feng. Even if we don't kill him this time, we must break his sky-crushing sword. Even if he retreats, he must pay the price. Almost at the same time, several cracks appeared in the void outside Shushan, and people walked out of them one after another. There were two people on the left. One of them was a tall middle-aged man. His whole body was like a gloomy thundercloud that never rained. Hidden in his dull appearance was an incomparably violent power. It was the current sect master of Purple Cloud Path, Dao Master Thundercloud. And the old man standing next to him was naturally the elder of Purple Cloud Path, and Dao Master Thundercloud's senior brother, Dao Master Blue Thunder. Both of them looked in the direction of Shushan with a dignified expression. For a moment, they could not figure out what Lin Feng meant. Beside them stood an old man dressed in black with a blue thunderbolt pattern embroidered on his lapel. His hair and beard were all fluttering, and he looked extremely mighty. He was the current leader of the Thunderbolt Sword sect, the Thunderbolt Sword Venerable. He looked at Shushan with a somewhat complicated expression. Disgust, hatred, fear, admiration, and other emotions flashed across his face. The other person who had the same expression as Sword Venerable of Thunderbolt was a middle-aged man in yellow with a calm expression on his face. He was the sect master of Wilderness Sword Sect and the current Sword Venerable of the Wilderness. They had always lived in the shadow of Shushan, and had extremely complicated feelings for the first holy land of Tianyuan swordsmanship. Even though they had chosen to support Xianmen Tianzong, they still could not calm down in the face of Shushan's sword sect. They looked at Lin Feng, who was strolling in the mountains of western Shu, with a somewhat complicated expression, as if they were looking forward to something, but they lacked confidence and were worried about gains and losses. Sword Venerable of Thunderbolt and Sword Venerable of the Great Wilderness did not speak, but Longevity Heavenly Spear said in a deep voice, "I admire the master of the celestial sect for his extraordinary cultivation. But since the Immortal Heaven Sword and the Big Dipper Sword Venerable have come out, why did he come to Shushan to fight with them? No matter which force it was, their own mountain gate was the most stable and had an absolute geographical advantage. Taking the initiative to attack someone else's nest, unless one's strength was significantly higher than the other party's, in most cases, one would be badly battered and bleeding in front of the other party's nest. The Great Immortal Phenomenon Sword Formation of Shushan Sword Sect was a formation that was as famous as the Taishu Temple's Great Void Yin-Yang Formation, and the Great Lane Temple's Vairocana Formation. It was also one of the most powerful formations in the Divine Land, with extremely powerful killing power. Lin Feng's Yujing Mountain could travel through time and space at will. In a sense, he was indeed the least afraid of going deep into the enemy's mountain gate. Any geographical advantage did not exist in front of him, because he could instantly turn the opponent's home ground into a neutral ground, or even his own home ground. But facing the Great Immortal Phenomenon Sword Formation of Shushan, this advantage would basically be wiped out. Moreover, whether it was the sect master of Shushan Sword Sect Xian Longsheng, Sword Venerable Heavenly Dipper, or Sword Venerable Firmament, none of them would sit back and watch Lin Feng attack their own formation. Therefore, for a moment, everyone could not figure out what Lin Feng meant. Hearing Longevity Heavenly Spear's words, the northern militant high priest slowly shook his head. I don't understand either. Longevity Heavenly Spear frowned and said, could it be that he was blinded by his previous victory or anger? That's not good. It was not only the forces that were on good terms with Xianmen Tianzong. In the distance, on the border between the Great Zhou Empire and the Great Qin Empire, Emperor Qin Stonefeather, Emperor Zhou's Liang Pan, and Zhu Hongwu were also looking at Shushan through the layers of void. Previously, the battle between Lin Feng and Sword Venerable Heavenly Dipper in the void was earth-shattering. With such a big movement, Stonefeather and the other two had been paying attention through the immortal Dragon City and the other two great treasures of creation. At this moment, seeing that Lin Feng had taken the initiative to come to Shushan's doorstep, even they could not see through it. The Master of the Celestial Gate is indeed extraordinary. Even Sword Venerable Heavenly Dipper would be at a disadvantage against him. His Yin and Yang life and death formation is even stronger than the one in West Hill City. It can actually trap the immortal heaven sword. Zhu Hongwu's eyes flickered. In the vast land of the Divine Land, there was a consensus that the cultivation world did not declare, but they all had in their hearts that the celestial sect of Xianmen was very shameless from head to toe. Because other than the mountain gate Yujing Mountain, even the great mountain protecting formation of life and death could move independently and freely. When Lin Feng attacked other people's mountain gates, he was never a commander without an army. Instead, he had to add Yujing Mountain and the formation of life and death, two powerful forces that could fight independently. The Master of the Celestial Gate can defeat Sword Venerable Heavenly Dipper, but it is not enough to kill him completely. Although his Yin and Yang life and death formation is stronger, I'm afraid it cannot trap Xian Longsheng and the immortal heaven sword for a long time. It seems that he is at a disadvantage. His Yujing Mountain can suppress the great immortal heaven sword formation, but it may not be able to break it completely. If Sword Venerable Heavenly Dipper controls the immortal heaven sword formation, Shu Mountain will be even stronger. Zhu Hongwu said in a low voice. Comparing the two, it is at best an undefeatable situation. Even with that unfilial son's Permitha bridge, he may be able to suppress Shu Mountain and gain the upper hand. Right now, Xianmen Tianzong is indeed above Shu Mountain, but it is impossible for him to completely destroy Shu Mountain. Liang Pan's expression was calm, but there was some confusion in his eyes. Hongwu, you are right. In that case, why did he take the initiative to come to Shu Mountain and challenge the great immortal heaven sword formation? Just fighting the immortal heaven sword and Sword Venerable Heavenly Dipper in the void would have a much better chance of winning. Chapter 878. Not only were Liang Pan and Zhu Hongwu confused, but Stonefeather and the others from the Qin dynasty were also confused. What does the Master of the Xian Gate want? Is it just to humiliate Shushan? But there's no need to do this. Defeating the Big Dipper Sword Venerable and Xian Longsheng with the immortal heaven sword in his hand in the void can achieve the same effect. If the Master of the Celestial Sect of Wonders is willing to pay a price, he can even make one of them fall completely. He came to Shu Mountain just to look good, and ended up in a stalemate. Why bother? Lord Rosen Shirzongmao frowned. Does the Master of the Celestial Sect have other tricks up his sleeves? Emperor Stonefeather did not say anything and looked into the distance. Emperor Liangpan sent a message to Zhu Hongwu. Hongwu, depending on the situation, I will hold Immortal Dragon City back if necessary. You go to Shushan. He paused and said silently, it is not necessary to target Xianmen Tianzong. The important thing is to improve Great Zhou. Zhu Hongwu answered. Your subject obeys. On Shushan, Sword Venerable Firmament snorted. If you want to climb Shushan and see the great immortal manifestation sword formation, I will satisfy you. He formed a sword seal with his right hand and pointed at the sky. A vast clear light suddenly fell from the sky, and turned into a powerful light pillar that enveloped Sword Venerable Firmament. The vast sword was like a vast world, boundless and enveloping the entire great thousand world. A hole opened at the top of the pillar of light, and an ancient bronze longsword slowly descended from it. The surface of the longsword was covered in sword light, vast but not dazzling. It was the ancient sword of firmament, one of the two strongest swords below the Shushan immortal sky sword. Alongside the ancient sword of heavenly dipper, sword venerable firmament grasped ancient sword venerable firmament. The powerful light pillar that enveloped him started to spread in all directions, as if it was going to cover the entire world. The entire Mount Shu began to shake violently. The 6 mountain peaks that belonged to the 6 pulse swords were shaking with a loud rumble. On each mountain peak that was like a sharp sword that pointed towards the sky, a thick pillar of light soared into the sky, surrounding and protecting the main peak of Mount Shu and Swordsman firmament. The beam of light from New Sun Sword Peak was vast and peaceful. The aura of the Way of the King was awe-inspiring and did not allow anyone to offend it lightly. The pillar of light from the Little Shang Sword Peak was the thickest, the cold light flashing, intimidating one's soul. The sword intent was also the most fierce and violent. Within the Shaozi Sword Peak's pillar of light, countless space fragments resonated with each other, sparkling and translucent. The concept of time fused into it and countless shadows flashed. The light pillar of the Guanchong Sword Peak was pure black, like a hard stone or iron, extremely heavy. The light pillar of the Lifeng Sword Peak was the weakest, but it contained the fiercest killing intent. The Lunar Sword Peak, on the other hand, was a pillar of qi that floated up to the 9 heavens. It was soft and flexible, ever-changing and unpredictable. Under the protection of the 6 sword peaks, the main peak of Mount Shu, which was originally suspended in the air, continued to rise into the sky amidst loud rumbling sounds. Below the main peak of Shushan, a huge pillar of air appeared. The pillar of air fell in the middle of the 6 peaks below, as if it was a pillar that supported the main peak of Shushan. Within the pillar of air, shadows rose and fell, and impressively, an uncountable number of swords were suspended in the air. Countless sharp swords, at this moment, in the pillar of air, had transformed into the shape of light swords. The light swords sometimes maintained their original appearance, and at other times, transformed into all kinds of images. There were flood dragons in the sea, fierce tigers in the mountains, lonely peaks and precipitous cliffs, rivers and lakes, and the images were all-encompassing, as if they contained all things in the world. These illusions were flowing with divine light, looking vivid and lifelike. The only similarity was that each image contained a biting cold sword intent. However, at this moment, these sword intents seemed a little manic, as if they were not satisfied with being bound by the pillar of air. They wanted to break free from the pillar of air and fly into the sky. Venerable Firmament, holding the ancient sword Firmament, left the main peak of Shushan and directly fell into the pillar of air. Immediately, around the pillar of air, on each of the 6 peaks of Shushan's 6 meridian swords, a huge circular spirit design appeared. These 6 prototype spirit designs were like rings on the waist of each of the 6 peaks. An even larger circular spirit design, which seemed to encompass the heavens, appeared in the shape of a ring around the waist of the main peak of Shushan, and expanded in all directions. The light pillars on the 6 sword peaks rose upwards, and all merged into it. Within the pillar of air below the main peak, the light and shadows gradually disappeared. Endless sword shadows and scenes of all things in the world rose and fell in the largest circular spirit design, and there was no need for them to emerge. A vast expanse of white, overwhelming sword aura surged in all directions like a tidal wave. It was as vast as the waves, yet incomparably sharp, cutting through the heavens and the earth. This was the protective formation of Shushan, the great immortal heaven's 1000 phenomenon sword formation. Lin Feng carefully felt the changes in the formation, and his eyes became brighter and brighter. A smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and he nodded repeatedly. Not bad, not bad. It is indeed extraordinary. As expected of the world-shocking formation that once heavily injured Blood River Man, and broke the primordial Taoya's belly, it is indeed unique. Lin Feng clicked his tongue in praise. The thunderous voice of Sword Venerable Firmament came from Shushan. Master of the Mystic Gate, take a sword from Shushan. The huge great immortal heaven all manifestation sword formation suddenly activated, and within the circular light formation, thousands of sword auras turned into raging waves, blasting towards Lin Feng. These sword auras were not just pure sword intent, but contained all kinds of innumerable truths of the great Tao. There were sword auras that evolved into boundless flames, about to burn the sky and boil the sea. There were sword auras that evolved into a magnificent sea, roaring and surging. There were sword auras that evolved into stars in the sky, and the stars moved and changed their positions. There were sword auras that evolved into thunderbolts, constantly exploding. There were sword auras that evolved into torrential rains and gales, continuous and unending. Everything in the world was magnificent, and all of them evolved within the great immortal heaven, all manifestations sword formation. However, all of this did not appear messy or scattered, and the power of the sword formation was not diluted. Instead, everything was fused into a furnace, as though a real world was manifested, and it suppressed towards Lin Feng. At the same time, Sword Venerable Heavenly Dipper also moved forward, and with a swing of his sword, the sky split open. The sword auras and starlight merged, covering the sky and falling towards Lin Feng. Xian Longsheng and the Immortal Heaven Sword were also charging left and right inside the yin and yang life and death formation, wanting to kill their way out. Lin Feng looked at the sword formation in front of him and nodded his head. This shouldn't be the strongest state of this formation. Otherwise, in terms of pure offensive power, this formation alone can compete with a creation magic treasure. Right now it's not too far off. It should be because Sword Sovereign Firmament is presiding over it. It can't unleash its strongest power, because it lacks a treasure to suppress the formation core? In that case, that strange sect returning scabbard should be the treasure to suppress this formation, and the Immortal Heaven Sword might be able to do so as well. Unfortunately, neither of them is here now. This Sword Venerable Firmament should be at the first tribulation stage, and he hasn't completely completed his first tribulation. His sword intent is compatible with the Great Immortal Universe sword formation, which is equivalent to two first tribulation stage cultivators fighting together. It's not much weaker than Sword Venerable Heavenly Dipper, or the Immortal Heaven Sword. Feeling the sword intent and sword chi of the Great Immortal Heaven Thousand Phenomenon sword formation, Lin Feng's mind spun like lightning in an instant, already analyzing the situation clearly. Looking at the huge sword formation, he said with a smile, "All of you want to fight with me? No rush, no rush. Today, all of you have a share, and none of you can escape." With a shake of the heaven-crushing sword in his right hand, he first attacked Sword Venerable Heavenly Dipper. Then he spread open his left hand and pressed down on the Great Immortal Universe sword formation. Amidst the rumbling, the purple sea of clouds kept tumbling, and Yujing Mountain descended onto the mortal world, falling toward Shu Mountain. At the peak of Shu Mountain, a sword aura like the blue sky soared into the sky, blocking the falling Yujing Mountain. At the peak of Yujing Mountain, the mysterious sky treasure tree emitted a light that resembled a crystal barrier. Together with the chaotic light of Yujing Mountain itself, they merged into the cyclic purple chi. As the purple chi surged, it gradually turned into a translucent white, like jade. The white jade clouds continued to fall, carrying Yujing Mountain. The majestic sword aura, which was as vast as the sky, could not withstand it and kept shattering, as if the sky was falling and the earth was cracking. The light waves released by the Great Immortal Universe sword formation returned to the main peak of Shu Mountain, merging with the sword aura of firmament. Together, they rose up and finally blocked the falling Yujing Mountain. The two great forces clashed, as if two worlds were constantly confronting each other. Below Yujing Mountain and above Shu Mountain, the void was constantly being destroyed and shattered. The majestic forces of the two worlds pressed together, causing spatial cracks to appear. However, they were not ordinary black spatial cracks, but cracks that flashed with dazzling light. These were cracks that had been formed when the power of a realm was activated, forcibly squeezing out the cracks of the Great Thousand Realms. The vast space between the two mountains was filled with such spatial cracks, as if the world was about to be destroyed. It looked extremely terrifying. Seeing that the Great Immortal Universe sword formation was being suppressed by Yujing Mountain, Celestial Dipper Swordsman took a deep breath and raised the ancient sword Celestial Dipper high. The Immortal Heaven Galaxy River fruit appeared, and the majestic celestial dipper sword Qi and celestial dipper sword will converged. The cracks in the sky caused the starry sky to tremble. It was not just a tremble, but the entire Milky Way was really trembling. Celestial Dipper Swordsman activated his dermic power and sword will, causing the stars in the sky to fall together. They seemed to transform into his sword edge, attacking Lin Feng. Tens of thousands of sword auras spiraled and merged, forming a majestic sword aura. Tens of thousands of sword auras gathered together, forming a dazzling sword aura. Tens of thousands of dazzling sword auras crisscrossed, forming a terrifying sword formation that shook the heavens and the earth. Tens of thousands of sword auras merged with the stars in the sky, forming an even more terrifying celestial dipper sword star. Now many celestial dipper sword stars had gathered together, forming a celestial river of sword light. A celestial river flowed straight down, sweeping towards Lin Feng. Within the celestial river, numerous celestial dipper sword stars, innumerable terrifying sword formations, innumerable resplendent sword lights, innumerable vigorous sword auras, innumerable sharp sword auras, all of it converged into this one sword strike. This was the strongest sword attack that Celestial Dipper Swordsman had condensed in his lifetime cultivation. Lin Feng looked at the sword aura and nodded slightly. Let's fight. He raised the heaven-punishing sword high up, and a boundless bloodlight filled the sky. All the acupoints on his body were pulsating, and each acupoint lit up with a ball of light. Within each ball of light, there seemed to be a god awakening, chanting the great Tao of heaven and earth together. The power of the many light shadows gathered together, shaking the heavens and earth. As the black and white light flickered, it fused with the blood-red heaven-punishing sword, forming a blurry and gloomy sword aura that struck fear in everyone's heart. It was like a rainbow that could destroy the heavens and the earth, and it slashed toward Celestial Dipper Sword Star River. Chapter 879. All the spectators widened their eyes at this moment. Even the White Cloud Mountain, the gate of the Taishu Temple, had a faint fluctuation of divine senses, paying close attention to this duel. Sword Venerable of the Thunderbolt, Sword Venerable of the Great Wilderness, Sword Venerable of Flowing Light, and the others widened their eyes and stared at the place where the two swords met. They were extremely nervous and had an indescribable and extremely complicated feeling. Lin Feng waved his sword, and the blurry and dark sword light seemed to mark the end of a world of creation. A faint sound rang between heaven and earth, ethereal and mournful, as if they were singing an elegy together. The destructive rainbow collided with the heavenly sword galaxy without making any sound. At this moment, the void between heaven and earth suddenly became silent. Even the sounds of the fierce battle between Yujing Mountain and the great immortal heavens manifestation sword formation, Xian Longsheng, the celestial heaven sword, and the yin and yang life and death formation in the distance disappeared. In the silent silence, the dark rainbow cut the heavenly sword galaxy in half. The stars of the sword light collapsed and turned into sword formations. The sword formations then collapsed and turned into rays of sword light. The rays of sword light continued to collapse and turned into rays of sword energy. Then the rays of sword energy also shattered and turned into rays of sword chi. In the end, all the sword chi dissipated and turned into nothingness, no longer existing. The majestic heavenly sword galaxy was like a long sword with its own physical form, but it was cut in half by another sword that was even sharper. The first half of the broken sword lost its direction and broke through the void, disappearing from the vast thousand worlds. However, in the invisible space of the universe, it turned into a ray of light and swept all the way, destroying countless stars. Sword Venerable Tiangong's eyes dimmed for a moment. At that moment, his face seemed to have aged a lot, and his tall body seemed to have stooped a little. The immortal heaven galaxy fruit in front of him was also destroyed by Lin Feng's sword. Sword Venerable Tiangong's eyes lit up again, and the broken half of the galaxy returned to protect him. It was completely cut into pieces by the dark, destructive rainbow. Some white flowing light scattered between heaven and earth, as if blood was splashing out from a human wound. It was the damaged essence of the great path of the great Dipper Swordsman. He held the ancient sword Heavenly Dipper in his hand and retreated, leaving a wound on his right hand that was holding the sword. If he hadn't pulled back his sword in time to defend himself, Lin Feng's attack would have severed his right arm. The number 1 sword cultivator of Shushan, the number 1 sword cultivator of Tianyuan, had been defeated. The thunderous sword venerable and the others heaved a long sigh of relief. For a moment, they felt both gratified and frustrated. In the war between the two worlds more than 4,600 years ago, after the death of the previous sect master of Mount Shu, Sword Venerable Tiangang of Mount Shu became the number 1 sword cultivator in the cultivation world of the divine land of the Great Heaven Primordial World. Apart from the War of the Two Realms, when he was active in the divine land, most of the primordial divinity adepts were not even born yet. By the time Honorable Swordsman of the Thunderclap and the others had proven their primordial divinity and stepped onto the stage of history, Honorable Swordsman of the Big Divinity had already retired to Mount Shu to challenge the Dharma-ending tribulation. He had been living in seclusion most of the time. For Honorable Swordsman of the Thunderclap and the others, and even their predecessors, Honorable Swordsman of the Big Divinity was half a historical figure. In his long life, Honorable Swordsman of the Thunderclap and the others had participated in 3 wars between the two worlds. He had participated in the decisive battle between the righteous and the demonic that ended the Middle Era. He had experienced many battles between the Mount Shu Sword Sect and other sects and forces in the Divine Land. He had personally killed 2 experts at the initial tribulation stage, 7 at the Dao integration stage of the human tribe or the demon tribe, and dozens below the Dao integration stage. However, this number 1 sword cultivator of the Divine Land had been defeated by Lin Feng at this moment. The void in the distance shook violently, and several figures appeared. The 2 people in the lead were the current sect master of the Heavenly Sword Sect, Honorable Swordsman of the Heavenly Sword Sect, and the Venerable Swordsman of the sect. At this moment, they were also shocked by the scene in front of them. They were so excited that they could not even hide themselves anymore. Although the Mount Shu Sword Sect was supported and hindered by the Taishu Temple, the Heavenly Sword Sect's ruling position among the sword sects was deeply understood by everyone in the Heavenly Sword Sect. At this moment, seeing Honorable Swordsman of Mount Shu defeated by Lin Feng, even Honorable Swordsman of the Heavenly Sword Sect, Honorable Swordsman of the Heavenly Sword Sect, could not control their state of mind. All the sword cultivators in the world had complicated feelings at this moment, and the Mount Shu cultivators felt like the sky was falling and the earth was sinking. Honorable Swordsman of the Lunar Sword Sect, Honorable Swordsman of the Shaozi Sword Sect, and Honorable Swordsman of the Guanchong Sword Sect were all ashen-faced. Honorable Swordsman of the New Sun Sword Sect frowned, and looked at Lin Feng and Honorable Swordsman of the Big Divinity Sword Sect in the void for a long time. Lin Feng put his left hand behind his back, and held his sword in his right hand. He turned to look at the yin and yang life and death array and said indifferently, Xian Longsheng, you have not completely recovered from the degeneration tribulation, and cannot endure a long battle. If you continue to fight with my yin and yang life and death array, even if you can escape in the end, I'm afraid you will not be able to control the immortal heaven sword. Lin Feng extended his left hand from behind his back, and changed his hand seals. The yin and yang life and death array was suddenly withdrawn, releasing Xian Longsheng and the immortal heaven sword. Xian Longsheng's eyes were burning as he stared at Lin Feng. Lin Feng waved his hand, and the yin and yang life and death array was activated again. It turned into a light screen that covered the sky, separating Yujing Mountain and Mount Shu. It replaced Yujing Mountain, and clashed with the great immortal heaven sword array. The battle between the 2 top arrays began, and the sky and earth were dark. It was not as easy as before. The yin and yang life and death array brought less pressure to Swordsman Firmament and the great immortal heaven sword array than to Yujing Mountain, but they could not be distracted. On the other hand, Yujing Mountain released the cosmic light of extreme, and shrouded Honorable Swordsman of the great immortal heaven sword array, preventing him from taking another step. Lin Feng looked at Xian Longsheng calmly. I know you want to repeat the battle in West Hill City. Now I will give you this chance. This time there will be no disturbance from the Taishu Temple, and there will be no Dharma-ending calamity. You and I will fight again, one man and one sword. Xian Longsheng's eyes burst with a shocking light. Slowly he said, one sword. Lin Feng nodded. Up to you. Xian Longsheng let out a clear cry, like the cry of a sword in the 9 heavens. He held his sword horizontally in front of his chest, and the index and second fingers of his left hand gently brushed across the surface of the immortal heaven sword. The surface of the white, jade-like sword flickered with a lustrous light. The light was not intense, but it was not weak, and it resonated with the laws of the Great Path. It was like the ruler of the Great Path. Wherever the tip of the sword pointed, the endless spiritual qi of the world gathered and turned into boundless sword qi. The entire world seemed to have become the tip of the immortal heaven sword, and its target was Lin Feng. Holding the immortal heaven sword, Xian Longsheng casually pointed at Lin Feng. The world froze, and the invisible sword intent turned into a tangible edge, sweeping toward Lin Feng. In all directions, there was no place that did not contain the edge of the immortal heaven sword. After the tribulation, Xian Longsheng had comprehended the immortal heaven sword qi, and obtained the greater thousand sword realm. Like the Big Dipper Sword Venerable's Heavenly Sword Galaxy and Big Dipper Sword Star, it was a sword Dao that belonged solely to a Shu Mountain sword cultivator after the tribulation, and the foundation of the immortal heaven sword qi. The Big Dipper Sword Venerable's sword moved the galaxy, while Xian Longsheng's sword turned the world into a sharp edge. Wherever the edge pointed, there was nothing it could not destroy. It turned the entire world into its own sword realm, and the enemy trapped in the sword realm would have to bear the killing of the entire world. This sword Dao was extremely compatible with the immortal heaven sword. When the sword aura spread out, it immediately pressed down on Lin Feng with an earth-shattering force, making him feel like he was surrounded by enemies. It was as if his existence was not tolerated by the world, and he was unnecessary. Only by quickly disappearing would he be in line with the righteous path of the world. Sword Venerable Tongtian, Elderly Sword Immortal, Sword Venerable of the Thunderous Sword, and the other sword cultivators all unsheathed their swords. They were actually attracted by the immortal heaven sword, and seemed to want to attack Lin Feng together. Everything in the divine land that could be called a sword trembled slightly, wanting to fly toward the immortal heaven sword. Lin Feng calmly looked at Xian Longsheng. The black and white light around him suddenly dimmed until it was almost undetectable. He flicked the blade of the sky-crushing sword with a finger, and the mournful blood-red light also dimmed. The blood-red light that had enveloped the world seemed to have disappeared. What had changed was the heaven-punishing sword's blade itself. The originally glistening and translucent blade had now become as red as blood. The blade didn't reflect any dazzling sword light, but it was completely blood-red. A faint light kept rolling on the blade of the sky-crushing sword. It was a black and white light that looked like a small dot or a drop of water that streaked across the blood-red blade. But looking at Lin Feng and the sky-crushing sword in his hand, Xian Longsheng's expression became unprecedentedly serious. The immortal heaven sword in his hand also let out a rare long cry. Sword Venerable Tongtian, Sword Venerable of the Thunderous Sword, Sword Venerable of the Flowing Light Sword, Sword Venerable of the Great Wilderness, and the others, who couldn't lift their heads under the pressure of the immortal heaven sword, felt much more relaxed now. They stared at the immortal heaven sword and the sky-crushing sword in a daze as a predestined battle unfolded. Lin Feng's movements were casual and carefree, as if he didn't care about this battle at all. He gently waved the seemingly ordinary sky-crushing sword in his hand. However, wherever the blood-red blade touched, the immortal heaven sword formed from the spiritual energy of the world would all disintegrate. Lin Feng pointed the tip of his sword at Xian Longsheng and the immortal heaven sword. He stepped into the void and stepped forward. The great thousand-sword realm continued to collapse, as if a world of creation was approaching its end and turning into nothingness. The faint black and white light became more and more dazzling. As the sky-crushing sword flashed, a torrential evil aura burst forth, destroying all living beings and collapsing the void. Xian Longsheng shouted, and also stepped forward with the immortal heaven sword in his hand. The tip of his sword was also pointed straight at Lin Feng and the sky-crushing sword. In an instant, countless shadows appeared between heaven and earth. Among the shadows, Lin Feng and Xian Longsheng each held the sky-crushing sword and the immortal heaven sword, and their swords clashed countless times. All kinds of nimble sword moves intertwined, dazzling the onlookers. This was the most agile sword move in the world. But in the end the shadows dissipated, leaving only Lin Feng and Xian Longxing walking straight toward each other. The tips of the sky-crushing sword and the immortal heaven sword were pointing at each other. This was a duel between Daos that surpassed sword techniques. Only this duel could truly determine the victor. When the two sides collided, countless spiritual energy and evil aura were destroyed. Endless light spread in all directions from the point where the two peerless divine swords collided, sweeping across the entire Great Thousand World. The spectators could only see the endless flashes of sword light. All the images and sounds were annihilated. All the nascent soul cultivators felt as if their primordial spirits were about to be pierced through. In the distance, Shi Yuliang Pan and Zhu Hongwu also felt a faint stabbing pain in their divine senses, as if they were mortals looking directly at the sun. Chapter 880. The violent waves continued to sweep in all directions. All the swords in the divine land were fighting fiercely, and many mortal swords' blades were directly broken, whether they were right in front of them or far away. Cracks also appeared on the swords of the lower-grade magic treasures. The light waves dissipated, and everyone focused their attention on it. Everyone was slightly stunned when they saw it. Sword Venerable Tongtian, Old Sword Immortal, Thunderous Sword Venerable, and Flowing Light Sword Venerable were even a bit dazed. In the sky, Lin Feng and Xian Longxing were still facing each other, far away in the void. It was as if their positions had never changed. They were not facing each other, but were still in the same position before the battle. The sky-crushing sword in Lin Feng's hand had returned to its original appearance. It was like a pool of limpid autumn water, flashing with a fierce, clear light, and a blood-red sword light flowing on the blade. Black and white divine light surged from his body, and countless characters and talismans floated in the sky, turning into layers of light. Xian Longxing also held the immortal heaven sword, and stood in the void silently. The spirit energy of heaven and earth gathered toward him, turning into an incomparably huge, invisible sword edge that was everywhere, pointing at Lin Feng. However, even an ordinary mortal could clearly see that blood-red cracks had appeared on the originally flawless immortal heaven sword's blade. The result of the battle just now was that Xian Longxing's immortal heaven sword was injured by Lin Feng's sky-crushing sword. The Emperor of Swords, the #1 divine sword in the heaven origin world, the ancestor of all swords, the immortal heaven sword, the creation Dharma treasure, was damaged. After the immortal heaven sword was completely perfected and became a creation Dharma treasure, it had been damaged before. It had also been defeated and damaged in battles against powerful enemies. However, in battles against other sword Daros and Dharma treasures, the immortal heaven sword had never tasted defeat, and had always been an invincible existence. But today the immortal heaven sword was defeated, and it was injured by other sword Daos. Sword Venerable Tongtian and the other sword cultivators stared blankly at Lin Feng, and the sky-crushing sword in his hand, unable to recover for a long time. Deep in their hearts, the immortal heaven sword Qi and the altar where the immortal heaven sword stood on were constantly crumbling. After Tiangang Sword Venerable, the #1 swordsman in the divine land, was defeated by Lin Feng, and the heaven punishing sword, the #1 swordsman in the divine land, the immortal heaven sword, was also defeated. At this moment, Xian Longxing's eyes were gloomy, and his face was a little ruined. He was not depressed, but because he had not fully recovered from the Dharma-ending catastrophe, his magic power inevitably fell into a low after that sword attack. He stared at Lin Feng and said word by word, "I was the one who lost, not the heavenly immortal sword energy or the heavenly immortal sword." Just now, Xian Longxing perfectly displayed his full strength. Even when facing Lin Feng and the heaven-punishing sword, he was able to display his full strength. However, after this attack he no longer had the strength to activate the immortal heaven sword to its limit. "I'm not as good as you, not because the heavenly immortal sword energy is inferior to your heaven-punishing sword energy, and definitely not because the immortal heaven sword lost to your heaven-punishing sword." Xian Longxing took a deep breath, took out the immortal heaven sword, and flew toward Yujing Mountain, which was blocking Tiangang Sword Venerable's way. Lin Feng calmly watched this scene, and made Yujing Mountain move out of the way, allowing Xian Longsheng to successfully deliver the immortal heaven sword to Tiangang Sword Venerable. Yujing Mountain suddenly moved and landed on top of Lin Feng's head, faintly discernible in the void. Tiangang Sword Venerable held the ancient sword in his left hand, and there were still specks of white light floating on his right arm. He had already refined his body into his origin spirit, and his origin spirit could easily change ordinary injuries, at least not on the outside. At this moment, his injury could not be healed because his foundation was injured by Lin Feng's sword. He needed to rest, and there was no time or energy to care during the battle. But now, Tiangang Sword Venerable used his injured right hand to catch the immortal heaven sword, and threw the ancient sword to Xian Longsheng. The spirit chi of heaven and earth gathered toward him, and a shocking scene appeared. The injury on Tiangang Sword Venerable's right arm was gradually healing. The blood-red cracks on the immortal heaven sword's blade also disappeared at a speed visible to the naked eye. With the immortal heaven sword in Tiangang Sword Venerable's hand, the power of both sides gradually resonated, and there was a vague effect of 1 + 1 being greater than 2. Tiangang Sword Venerable, who was in the Dharma-ending realm, activated the immortal heaven sword, and its power was different from when Xian Longsheng used it. The entire vast thousand domains seemed to have turned into a sea of starlight, and each star was condensed by an unparalleled sword intent. Lin Feng bent his finger, and gently flicked the blade of his heaven-crushing sword. After the battle with the immortal heaven sword just now, the heaven-crushing sword's blade was now shining with a cold light, and there was only a trace of rust left. The terrifying sword intent that could destroy heaven and earth and destroy creation was unprecedentedly powerful. It had completely surpassed all Mahayana-grade Dharma treasures in the world, and even surpassed the power of other Dharma treasures that had the chance to become a creation Dharma treasure. It surpassed the incomplete Immortal Dragon City before the battle at West Hill City, the incomplete Book of Life and Death before the 6 Paths of Reincarnation, and the incomplete Permitha Golden Bridge. It could even be said that in terms of pure offensive power, this terrifying sky-crushing sword was not inferior to the celestial heavenly sword, a Dharma treasure of creation. Apart from being unable to withstand the Dharma-ending tribulation, it was no different from a Dharma treasure of creation in terms of power. In terms of pure offensive power and destructive power, it was even superior to some creation Dharma treasures. Lin Feng looked at Tiangang Sword Venerable in front of him and smiled faintly. Your Shu Mountain has the immortal heaven, and I have the heaven-crushing sword. It's up to you. Come and fight me. He drew the tip of his sword, stood tall, and fought against Sword Venerable Tiangang. The Celestial Dipper Sword Venerate activated the immortal heaven sword, and unleashed his most powerful divine ability, the Celestial Sword Star River. Boundless sword light fused with the stars and gathered together, sweeping toward Lin Feng like a surging river. Wherever the galaxy went, the scenery of heaven and earth followed. The spirit chi of the vast thousand worlds all entered the galaxy of sword light, causing the galaxy formed by the many Tiangang sword stars to become even more vast and majestic. The Celestial Sword Venerable, Thunderous Sword Venerable, Flowing Light Sword Venerable, and the other sword cultivators who were watching the battle made a seemingly ridiculous and embarrassing move. They all retreated and returned to their sects. However, the others did not laugh at them. If Celestial Sword Venerable and the others did not leave, they might be involuntarily attracted by the sword intent of the immortal heaven sword, and throw themselves into the heavenly sword galaxy to attack Lin Feng together. Even if they could control themselves, their swords would automatically leave their sheaths and merge with the tide of heaven and earth as swords and all things as blades. At this moment, all the mortal swords in the divine land flew out and gathered in the direction of Shu Mountain, toward Tiangang Sword Venerable and the immortal heaven sword. Many low and mid-tier flying swords also flew out. There were even nascent soul-level magic swords that flew over. Thousands of swords entered the heavenly sword galaxy together, making it even more dazzling. Those who had experienced the war between the two worlds 4,600 years ago were all shocked. For thousands of years, they had only seen such a scene in the war between the Divine Land and Tianhuang continent. That time, it was caused by the previous sect master of the Shu Mountain Sword sect controlling the immortal heaven sword. At this moment, it was as if the scene from thousands of years ago had reappeared. The The sky was filled with flying swords, extremely spectacular. Lin Feng slowly recited, "All the swords in the world come from Shu Mountain, but my sword is beyond the heavens." The sky-crushing sword in his hand shook, and all the sword light converged. The blade became blood-red again, and the black and white divine light condensed to the extreme, turning into a faint light that rolled on the tip of the sky-crushing sword. At this moment, the tip of the sky-crushing sword suddenly turned from blood-red to a chaotic, blurry color. It was so mysterious and unpredictable that it could not be described with words. However, wherever the tip of the heaven-crushing sword reached, the myriad domains were instantly reduced to nothingness. There was actually a faint flicker of light between the heavens and the earth, but after coming into contact with the tip of the heaven-crushing sword, the light completely dimmed and collapsed. Lin Feng waved the sword in his hand and directly split the Tiangang Sword Venerable's heavenly sword galaxy with the momentum of splitting the sea. Where the sword tip pointed, Lin Feng controlled the sky-crushing sword and the Tiangang Sword Venerable controlled the immortal heaven sword. What made the people of Shu Mountain shiver was that the scales of victory were gradually tipping in favor of Lin Feng and the sky-crushing sword. Even the Tiangang Sword Venerable was more and more shocked as the battle went on. Stonefeather, Liang Pan, Zhu Honggu, and the others who were still watching the battle had slightly serious expressions. Liang Pan shook his head slowly, but his tone was calm and calm. The mystique and dermic powers of the Master of the Celestial Gate are indeed shocking. Xianmen Tianzong is now firmly in the Divine Land, the second most powerful force after Taishu Temple. Even Taishu Temple will have to use all its strength to win. Zhu Hongwu's gaze was fixed on Yujing Mountain. He has the advantage against the Tiangang Sword Venerable and the Immortal Heaven Sword with the Sky-Crushing Sword, but to turn this into victory, he needs his Yujing Mountain to join the battle as well. However, although he can defeat the combination of Tiangang Sword Venerable and the Immortal Heaven Sword, he may not be able to kill Tiangang Sword Venerable or break the Immortal Heaven Sword. With his Tao Corroboration Dharma treasure, that bell, and that unfilial son's Permitha bridge, there is hope, Liang Pan said. Shu Mountain will not admit defeat so easily. He cannot suppress the others of Shu Mountain with just the yin-yang life and death formation. As they spoke, the peaks of Shu Mountain shook violently. The violent power made the great immortal heaven manifestation sword formation a little unstable, but it also affected the yin-yang life and death formation. Lin Feng lowered his head slightly, and saw that below the main peak of Shu Mountain, the 6 peaks of the 6 pulse swords had all uprooted and floated into the sky. The 6 thick pillars of light that enveloped the 6 peaks began to condense. Under the guidance of the pillars of light, the tips of the 6 sword peaks all merged into the huge circular formation that surrounded the main peak of Shu Mountain. During the process, the other 5 sword peaks were fine, but the rocks of Little Shang Sword Peak kept falling like rain, bombarding the undulating mountains below. The rocks on the periphery of the mountain kept falling, and the belly of the mountain flashed with dazzling light. That seemed to be an endless accumulation of sword light, and now it was finally released and saw the light of day again. The sword light that originally belonged to Little Shang Sword Peak first completely merged into the Great Immortal Heaven Manifestation Sword Formation. Then, the Great Immortal Heaven Manifestation Sword Formation seemed to have suddenly eaten a huge supplement, and the majestic force caused the yin-yang life and death formation to continuously retreat. The dazzling sword light continued to erupt, as if there was no end. Seeing this, Lin Feng's expression did not change at all. He carefully felt the yin-yang life and death formation, and instead nodded slightly in satisfaction. Chapter 881. The 6 peaks of Shushan's 6 meridian sword armament had been passed down through generations of Shushan swordsmen over the years. Boundless sword will had long been integrated into the peaks, making them truly sword peaks. Throughout Shushan, many sword cultivators, regardless of their level of cultivation, converted the spiritual chi of heaven and earth into their own sword will and spiritual power during their daily training. In this process, they constantly nourished the sword peaks they were on. Now that the 6 sword peaks had been uprooted, the Shushan disciples on the mountains had all been moved. The Little Shang Sword Peak was the first to shatter, releasing the sword will it had accumulated over the years and pouring it into the Great Immortal Universe Sword Formation. the mountains shattered and the sword will integrate it. After this battle, the Little Shang Sword Peak would no longer exist. If there were any experts left in Shushan, they would move mountains and seas to rebuild the Little Shang Sword Peak. Shushan would continue to burn incense, and the sword would accumulate again. As the battle progressed, the other 5 sword peaks were also ready to supply their accumulated sword will and sword chi to the great immortal universe sword formation at any time. The brilliant light made the world of the sword formed by the great immortal universe sword formation increasingly clear and real. Even the yin and yang life and death formation, under the bombardment of the explosive increase in power, kept retreating. It seemed to be on the verge of losing control of the great immortal universe sword formation. Xiaoyi, let me borrow your Permitha bridge for a while. Lin Feng said with a light smile, his expression relaxed. On Jade Capital Mountain, a magnificent golden bridge descended like a rainbow piercing through the sky, landing in the middle of the yin and yang life and death formation. Lin Feng smiled. Although it's not completely compatible, it's suitable for now. As the Permitha bridge entered the formation, the yin and yang life and death formation's power also skyrocketed, reaching a new level. It steadily suppressed the great immortal universe sword formation below. The brilliant light provided by the Little Shang Sword Peak was constantly worn down, until it was exhausted. Sword Venerable Firmament, who was in charge of the great immortal universe sword formation, was expressionless. With a sword gesture, the Little Shang Sword Peak that had been integrated into the formation began to disintegrate, turning into a sea of rubble that fell to the ground. It was as if a sword had been unsheathed and a peerless divine sword had been unsheathed from within. Its bright brilliance seeped into the great immortal universe's sword formation of all manifestations. Without flinching, it faced the yin and yang life and death formation above its head head-on. It wanted to break through the suppression of the yin and yang life and death formation and rendezvous with Big Dipper Swordsman. On the other side, the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign held the immortal heaven sword and silently looked at Lin Feng. He didn't waste any words and continued to advance. Lin Feng clasped his left hand behind his back and held the Heaven Destroyer sword in his right hand. Both of them dove into the void and fought like 2 gods of the universe, causing the heavens to collapse and the earth to crack. Watching the battle, Liang Pan and Zhu Hongwu secretly sighed in pity. Looking at Yujing Mountain, who was floating in the air as if he had nothing to do with it, they shook their heads. With Lin Feng's Yujing Mountain town there, others who wanted to take advantage of it would have to weigh their options and not act rashly. But this way, he will not be able to kill Sword Sovereign Tian Dipper, or break the immortal heaven sword. Even if he uses his treasure, he will only be able to defeat the Sword Sovereign and the immortal heaven sword. In order to completely kill him, he will have to fight to the death. Even if the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign fights to the death and is killed, he will have to pay a huge price himself. Liang Pan nodded. His Yujing Mountain is not only defending against us, but also against the interference of the people from Taishu Temple. But in this battle he is destined to only humiliate Shu Mountain, and not achieve a decisive result, unless he has other tricks up his sleeve. Liang Pan frowned slightly. It's still the same question. Why must he come to Shu Mountain to fight? Zhu Hongwu's eyes narrowed. The immortal heaven sword. His target is the immortal heaven sword. When fighting in the void without the great immortal phenomenon sword formation to distract Lin Feng, the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign and the immortal heaven sword would be in a much more dangerous situation. But there is still a high chance that they can escape. If the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign is willing to sacrifice himself, he can guarantee that the immortal heaven sword will escape. He came to Shu Mountain because he is certain that he can completely trap the immortal heaven sword here. But what is he going to do? In the current situation, even if the immortal heaven sword is defeated, it can still escape. The ruler and minister of the Great Zhou were perplexed, unable to find an answer no matter how they thought about it. And Sword Venerable Celestial Dipper, who was currently battling Lin Feng, also had the same doubts in his heart. But for him who was currently at a disadvantage, dealing with Lin Feng's destroying sky decimating earth attack was the most important matter. This was the most peak sword battle in the Divine Land in the past 10,000 years. His Shu Mountain had lost again and again, and he could not afford to lose this round. Determination flashed in the eyes of the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign. He held the immortal Heaven Sword in his right hand, and fought with Lin Feng. The index and 2 fingers of his left hand formed a sword and pointed at Lin Feng. A dark and gloomy black gas turned into a perfectly straight black line, shooting towards Lin Feng. The 5 decrements of the heavens, the Dharma-ending calamity. Wherever the black aura passed, it was as if the entire world was withering and ushered in the end of the world. It was an irreversible and final destruction. Seeing this, Lin Feng chuckled. Rays of 7-colored light flashed on his void-returned Dharma body and circled around his body. The black aura of the Dharma-ending calamity directly pierced through Lin Feng's body, but it did not cause any harm to him. It was as if Lin Feng was just an illusion. The Dharma-ending calamity released by the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign fell on thin air, just like that. All the spectators widened their eyes. Even the spiritual senses of the distant white cloud mountain trembled slightly. Before the opponent's Dharma-ending calamity was triggered and locked onto him, there was still a chance for him to avoid it. However, once the Dharma-ending calamity was triggered, it was not something that the opponent could avoid by hiding in the void. This would trigger the Deva's 5 decrepit phenomena in the opponent's body and produce a world-destroying power. At the same time, the caster would also have to bear the same Dharma-ending calamity. But now the result was that the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign had to bear the Dharma-ending calamity for nothing, while Lin Feng was unscathed. The Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign stared fixedly at Lin Feng. Lin Feng's figure was faintly discernible in the void. He could clearly see him, but he had completely disappeared from his senses, as if that figure did not exist at all. 2 years ago, in the Battle of the Ying Sea, Lin Feng had used Yujing Mountain to avoid the Dharma-ending calamity of Golden Cicada, which had already shocked the world. Now the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign saw that Lin Feng was not on Yujing Mountain, so he gave it a try. Who would have thought that Lin Feng himself could also avoid the Dharma-ending calamity? Lin Feng's expression was calm. The colorful halos around him disappeared, and he appeared in the void again. This was the mysterious heavenly escape. Lin Feng had comprehended the power of the mysterious heaven treasure tree on the top of Yujing Mountain. It was an exquisite escape magic power that exhausted the mystery of time and space, and also integrated many kinds of great ways of heaven and earth into it. If it was only the change of time and space, it would not be able to avoid the Dharma-ending calamity. When he was in the primordial spirit incarnation realm, he indeed had to rely on the power of the mysterious heaven treasure tree to use it. But now that he had successfully refined his spirit to return to the void, he could also use it alone. However, the Dharma-ending calamity damaged the great ways after all, and he could only use it a limited number of times in a certain period of time. However, the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign would not continue to attack with the Dharma-ending calamity. Lin Feng used the mysterious heavenly escape to avoid the Deva's 5 blights, but he took it head-on. Even if the limit of the Dharma-ending calamity he could withstand was more than a single digit, the attack of the blights would also weaken his magic power. Even the cultivators in the Dharma-ending realm would not easily use the Dharma-ending calamity to fight, and bet on who could withstand more. Although they could slowly recover from the blights, they would be seriously injured during the battle, and their combat power would be reduced. While fighting intensely, they would not have any spare energy to recover from the blights. This is the 4th magic power in the history of the Tianyuan world that can avoid the Dharma-ending calamity. The Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign's heart sank. In today's world, only the last technique of the 9 heavens of the Taishu Temple, the heavenly void mystic light, is left. The Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign believed that Lin Feng's magic power must be the same as the heavenly void mystic light, and it was not a magic power that could be used infinitely. However, without knowing the details of the mysterious heavenly escape and how many blights Lin Feng could withstand, he certainly would not continue to attack with the Dharma-ending calamity. Seeing that Lin Feng had actually avoided the Dharma-ending calamity launched by the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign, all the spectators fell into silence after a short period of sluggishness. They looked at the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign, who was at an even more obvious disadvantage because he had withstood a blight. In the void, the Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign did not say a word or make any sound. But his divine sense floated between heaven and earth like an exploding star. He merged with the immortal heaven sword, turned into a stream of light, and landed on Shu Mountain. Lin Feng looked down at the sky-crushing sword in his hand, which only had a trace of rust left. The various gains he had gained from the 3 consecutive battles with the immortal heaven sword Qi, and the immortal heaven sword, as well as the yin and yang life and death formation, and the great immortal universe sword formation, flashed through his mind. Slowly he nodded. At least 80% confidence is enough. At this time, in addition to the Shaoshang Sword Peak and the Shaozi Sword Peak, Sword Sovereign Firmament had also shattered the Taiyin Sword Peak and the Guancheng Sword Peak. The sword momentum of the Great Immortal Universe sword formation surged, and it was locked in a stalemate with the yin and yang life and death formation, suppressed by the Permitha Golden Bridge. The Celestial Dipper Sword Sovereign's sword fell, and the yin and yang life and death formation, which was under attack from both sides, gave way under Lin Feng's control, allowing Sword Sovereign Firmament and the Immortal Heaven Sword formation to return to Shu Mountain. Sword Sovereign Firmament immediately transferred the control of the Great Immortal Universe sword formation to Sword Sovereign Firmament. Sword Sovereign Firmament guided the Immortal Heaven sword formation in his hand, and the aura of the entire Great Immortal Universe sword formation suddenly changed. Boundless sword light shot into the sky, and the world of swords suddenly expanded, as if it wanted to control the entire world. The vast 1,000 worlds, and the divine land suddenly seemed to become a world of swords. With the Immortal Heaven sword's control, the Great Immortal Universe sword formation finally pushed its power to the extreme. Originally, there were only pieces of sword peaks, but now, the Savage Leaving Sword Peak and the Shaoyang Sword Peak shattered together. 2 bright rays of light simultaneously entered the Great Immortal Universe sword formation. The power of the sword formation suddenly surged, and with the support of the sword formation, the power of the Immortal Heaven sword also increased. Sword Sovereign Firmament swung the Immortal Heaven sword in his hand, and the entire world turned into invisible sword edges that fell like rain, stabbing toward Lin Feng. An unprecedented violent power erupted since the start of the battle. This power had slaughtered 480 million blood godscions of the Blood River tribe in the past, and killed the primordial Taotai with a single sword. It hadn't appeared even during the war between the 2 worlds 4,000 years ago. The last time it had appeared was 10,000 years ago. Now it had finally reappeared in the world. Seeing this, Lin Feng nodded slightly. Not bad, it's indeed extraordinary. But this time, you won't be able to escape. Chapter 882. In the blink of an eye, Lin Feng felt that everything in the world had turned into cold swords stabbing at him. The stars in the sky, the earth under his feet, the white clouds in the sky, the peaks of Shu Mountain before him, the streams between the mountains and the lush greenery, even the glaciers in the distant Arctic tundra, the swamps in the southern wastelands, the desert wastelands in the northwest, and the waves of the East Sea seemed to have crossed through layers of space and arrived at Shu Mountain. They all turned into swords stabbing at him. The mud tiles and bamboo strips in a small village also seemed to have turned into swords, piercing through space and time. In the void where he was right now, every bit of spiritual qi that was originally under his control seemed to have instantly turned into an enemy, a fatal threat and a killing move. He breathed lightly and circulated his spirit qi and dermic powers. He felt like his body was being torn apart. The prickling pain was both fake and real. Lin Feng smiled. He held the heaven-crushing sword in his right hand and spread the fingers of his left hand, making a pressing gesture at Shu Mountain below him. Yujing Mountain descended from the void. The white jade immortal mountain glowed with light. The branches of the mysterious sky treasure tree at the top of the mountain swayed, and the purple clouds kept rolling. As Lin Feng refined his spirit and returned to Yujing Mountain, the mysterious sky treasure tree finally returned from the various worlds. At this moment, the mysterious sky treasure tree shook and shone with 7-colored light. As for the 1,000-zhang-tall Yujing Mountain, the earth trembled and the mountain swayed as it grew rapidly. Lin Feng smiled. Grow, grow, grow. The originally 1,000-meter-tall Yujing Mountain instantly filled the sky and earth. It was much larger than the Fangzhong Immortal Mountain, which was the largest of the three mountains in the Yangtze, and had a length of 2,500 miles each. At the summit of Jade Capital Mountain, the light of the profound heaven-precious tree that resembled a crystal barrier, and the hazy chaotic light of Jade Capital Mountain itself once again fused into the cyclic purple chi, manifesting into auspicious clouds that resembled white jade. The overall power of Yujing Mountain was raised to the extreme and pressed down on the great immortal nature sword formation, and the immortal heaven sword. At the same time, a treasure light lit up above Lin Feng's head, and the melodious sound of a bell came from the void. A large bell broke through space and descended into the mortal world. It was Lin Feng's Dharma treasure to prove his Tao, the bell of good fortune. The image of the bell gradually changed, turning into a huge, pitch-black stone door. Its surface was covered with thousands of relief carvings, ancient and desolate, giving off a strong aura of life. Bang! The door made a muffled sound and slowly opened to both sides. An invisible river flowed out from the two doors that opened to both sides. The river flowed without stopping, neither fast nor slow, but it had a power that would never stop. The second stage of the Bell of Good Fortune, the River of Time. The river meandered around Yujing Mountain. The mountains and rivers were interdependent and complemented each other. With the support of the River of Time, the power of Yujing Mountain increased once again, and they withstood the strongest attack from the Mount Shu sword sect. Sword Venerable Celestial Dipper was expressionless. His majestic sword will began to concentrate on one point, pointing straight at Yujing Mountain. He wanted to split the mountain open and cut Yujing Mountain apart. The realm of heaven and earth was distorted, turning into a dazzling crack that flashed with white light. This crack was imprinted on the white jade auspicious cloud outside Yujing Mountain, and the seemingly solid white jade auspicious cloud kept on rolling. Master of the Mystic Gate, hand over your life. Sword Venerable Firmament stood beside Sword Venerable Celestial Dipper. He took a deep breath, formed a sword seal, knelt on one knee, and tapped on the main peak of Shushan below him. All sound had been annihilated, and only the main peak of Shushan, which was in the center of the great immortal nature sword formation, could be seen. The outer mountain walls were falling off like the 6 pulse sword mountains before, and the rocks that fell off did not fall to the ground like before. Instead, they turned into powder under the light of the sword formation. The outer mountain walls had all fallen off, and the main peak of Shushan had also turned into a ball of surging sword light. It was much more dazzling than any of the 6 pulse sword mountains before. Other than Sword Venerable Celestial Dipper and Sword Venerable Firmament, even the weakened Xian Longsheng had been transported into the great immortal nature sword formation with the other Shushan sword cultivators. This was to protect them, and also to strengthen the great immortal nature sword formation. The sword chi and spiritual power of tens of thousands of sword cultivators resonated together, connecting into one and shaking the void. Wherever Sword Venerable Celestial Dipper's immortal heaven sword pointed, the great immortal nature sword formation went completely berserk. After merging the sword will and sword chi accumulated on the main peak of Shushan, its power rose to its peak. For a moment all the spectators, including Stonefeather, Liang Pan, and Zhu Hongwu, who were controlling the immortal Dragon City, the Grand Imperial Palace, and the Great Celestial Wheel, felt a little dazed. In front of them, it was as if the entire world no longer existed. All that was left was a huge white jade sword. It was the appearance of the immortal heaven sword, but it was unprecedentedly huge. It was as if the entire vast thousand realms had become this immortal heaven sword. It was as if the entire world had become a sword, and the tip of this sword was pointing at Lin Feng and Yujing Mountain. At this moment, Lin Feng's expression was normal. He made a hand seal with his left hand, and the Permitha Golden Bridge left the Yin-Yang Life and Death Formation. The Yin-Yang Life and Death Formation merged with Yujing Mountain, turning into a true mountain-guarding formation. It suddenly unfolded, protecting Yujing Mountain in the center. Then Lin Feng himself, whose body was as huge as a star, also slammed his palm on the body of Yujing Mountain that had expanded dramatically. The black and white divine light of creation appeared on Yujing Mountain. One after another, balls of light rose from the black and white sea of light, like huge bubbles rising on the surface of the sea. Within these balls of light, countless chants of the great Tao rang out. It was as if gods had awakened one after another and opened their eyes. The entire Yujing Mountain was like a celestial kingdom in heaven. It was shocking and made the primordial soul cultivators yearn for it, wishing they could throw themselves into it. And the void around Yujing Mountain continued to collapse, turning into black and white balls of air. It was as if the universe had been reopened and the yin and yang had been established. Then, the wind of earth, water, and fire flowed. After it settled down, it turned into the 8 trigrams, showing the changes of the primordial world. This earth-shattering power confronted the sword of Shu Mountain that had turned everything in the world into a sharp edge. It did not let the other party take a step forward. All the spectators were shaken. This time, it was not only the Taishu Temple's White Cloud Mountain that was moving, and not only the entire Divine Land Pass. Even the Demon Realm's Tianhuang Land was stirred, as if it had been alarmed by this unprecedented battle. Liang Pan stared in the direction of Shu Mountain. The Permitha Golden Bridge has not moved yet, and Lin Feng's own heaven-crushing sword is still there. We can't do anything. Zhu Hongwu was also focused. Right now, Shu Mountain even has a slight advantage, but they can't win quickly and are in a stalemate. In fact, Shu Mountain has already lost. The sword intent and spiritual qi accumulated by the Shu Mountain sword peak will eventually be used up, and the situation will be reversed. But even if the heaven-crushing sword and the Permitha Golden Bridge join the battle, they will at most defeat Shu Mountain. If Sword Venerable Tiangang is willing to sacrifice his life, he can still protect the immortal heaven sword. What does Lin Feng want? Before he finished, Liang Pan and Zhu Hongwu's expressions changed. The other spectators were also in an uproar. Lin Feng supported Yujing Mountain with his left hand, and suddenly let go of the heaven-crushing sword with his right hand. Using a sword sacrifice method, the sword floated in the air by itself. A scabbard covered in cracks appeared in his right hand. It was the sect-returning scabbard. At the moment, the sect-returning scabbard was covered in dense blood-red cracks, as if it had come to a dead end. The heaven-crushing sword buzzed and voluntarily entered the sect-returning scabbard. But this time, it was the sect-returning scabbard that was trembling violently, as if it was genuinely afraid. Lin Feng's expression was relaxed. He gently tossed the sect-returning scabbard into the air, and when he caught it again, he was already holding the hilt of the sect-returning scabbard. With a swing of his hand, the red light on the cracks on the surface of the sect-returning scabbard suddenly burst forth. The scabbard, which had already reached its limit, instantly shattered into countless pieces. The eyes of the Shu Mountain cultivators almost popped out of their sockets, but what frightened them even more was that Lin Feng once again took out the heaven-crushing sword. The sword light swept up the fragments of the sect-returning scabbard, and then it turned into a long rainbow that flew toward Shu Mountain. The target of this blood-red rainbow was not the immortal heaven sword, but the great immortal universe sword array. As the rainbow moved forward, the thousands of fragments of the scabbard kept vibrating, trying to break away from the blood-red rainbow. But in the blink of an eye, the fragments of the scabbard, which were originally black, gradually turned blood-red. From inside to outside, they were an extremely transparent blood-red, giving off an extremely vicious aura. Sword Venerable Celestial Dipper's eyes flashed wildly, and his usually calm expression suddenly changed. He controlled the immortal heaven sword to guide the unparalleled divine sword in an attempt to intercept the blood-red rainbow. But Yujing Mountain immediately turned from defense to offense, and he did not dare to be distracted at all. The blood-red rainbow charged toward the great immortal universe sword array. At this moment, the entire sword array was won. Although the tip of the sword was aimed at Yujing Mountain, the entire sword array was like the blade of an unparalleled divine sword. And it was also extremely sturdy. The huge spirit formation suddenly activated, wanting to block the blood-red rainbow outside. But the blood-red fragments of the scabbard within the rainbow flashed, and the blood-red rainbow successfully pierced into the great immortal universe sword array. Sword Venerable Firmament's expression also changed. He controlled the ancient sword firmament to meet the blood-red rainbow. However, under Lin Feng's control, the Permitha Bridge followed closely behind the rainbow, and also entered the sword array, intercepting Sword Venerable Firmament. Everyone on Shu Mountain felt an extremely ominous omen, as if a great disaster was about to befall them. Lin Feng's voice reverberated in the sky. I have never been a bloodthirsty person, but I am definitely not a weakling who can be bullied. Other than those who are bent on provoking the dead, the Shu Mountain cultivators who did not participate in the siege of Xianmen Tianzong will not be held accountable, but those who participated will definitely pay the price, Lin Feng said indifferently. Those who offend Xianmen Tianzong will be killed no matter how far away they are. Dismembering a falling stone and injuring a member of my Xianmen Tianzong, I will kill him with my sword. Since your Shu Mountain attacked my Xianmen Mountain, I will also come to visit your Shu Mountain. Since your Shu Mountain wants to break my Xianmen life and death formation, I will break your great immortal universe sword array. Since your Shu Mountain wants to steal my heaven punishing sword, I will use the heaven punishing sword to break your immortal universe. Since you owe me justice, Xianmen Tianzong, you must pay it back. If you dare to not pay it back, I will beat you up until you pay it back. He formed a sword seal with his right hand and pointed at the great immortal universe sword array. From the moment I dismembered the falling stone and left Shu Mountain with the sect returning scabbard, came to Xianmen Tianzong, and returned to the Kiliacosm, everything was already destined. That's all there is to it. Chapter 883. Lin Feng calmly looked at the great immortal nature thousand phenomenon sword array in front of him. He formed a sword seal with his right hand and pointed lightly. The blood-colored streak of light that entered the sword formation went all the way down to the bottom of the formation, where there was a white pillar of energy that looked like a heavenly pillar. The blood-red sky-crushing sword revealed its true form and floated in the pillar of white qi. The fragments of the scabbard around it scattered in all directions and floated in the entire great immortal nature thousand phenomenon sword array. However, the most shocking thing was that the sky-crushing sword did not attack or destroy the great immortal nature thousand phenomenon sword array. Instead, it emitted a murderous aura that spread throughout the sword array. Under everyone's astonished gazes, the majestic white pillar of energy gradually turned blood red. Impossible. Even with the sect returning scabbard's cover, if it managed to sneak into the sword formation, a mere sword would only be suppressed by the sword formation until it couldn't move. Xian Longxing's face revealed a shocked expression, and he rarely lost his composure. However, the blood-red light became brighter and brighter. It began to spread from the pillar of qi to the entire great immortal nature thousand phenomenon sword array. The countless swords in the sword array began to vibrate violently. Clang, 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 clang. The ear-piercing sounds of metal breaking rose and fell incessantly. At first, they could be clearly distinguished one by one, but in the end, they became a deafening cacophony. The tens of thousands of swords in the great immortal nature thousand phenomenon sword array were all broken in the middle. The blades of the swords were all broken in the middle. The upper half of the blade turned into flowing light and disappeared, leaving only the lower half of the blade attached to the hilt. However, these broken swords did not show any signs of dejection or hostility toward the power that had broken them. Instead, they cheered as if they had broken free from the shackles that had bound them for many years. The tens of thousands of broken swords showed extreme hatred toward the immortal heaven sword above, and the sect returning scabbard floating in the array. All the broken swords seemed to be sentient beings with thoughts and emotions. They fell into a frenzy of rage and destroyed the fragments of the sect returning scabbard floating around them, turning those fragments into ashes. After destroying the sect returning scabbard fragments, the broken swords all flashed with black light from their broken blades. The black light extended continuously and actually condensed into light blades. Every broken sword had been restored to its original state. However, the half near the tip of the sword was condensed with black light. Following that, the black light kept flickering, causing the swords, including the sword hilt, to light up and turn into black swords of light. In an instant, the entire great immortal heaven manifestation sword formation had turned into a world of blood red and jet black. Under the combined effect of the myriad of black light swords and the blood red pillar of energy, all the rune patterns of the formation underwent an earth-shattering change. In an instant, the appearance of the formation had completely changed. The hundreds of millions of complicated rune patterns had changed beyond recognition. The array formation runes that shone with white light had already turned into a flickering black light, causing one's heart to palpitate. Monstrous hostility swept through the entire Shushan, and the heavens and the earth dimmed. Originally, seeing Mount Yujing, the bell of creation, the Yin-Yang life and death formation, the heaven-punishing sword, the golden Permitha bridge, and Lin Feng himself all enter battle, without any means to defend against surprise attacks from the outside world. Some of the people who were still restless immediately suppressed their original thoughts when they saw this astonishing change. Lin Feng looked at the completely changed sword formation below with a calm expression. Everyone in the Shushan sword sect was dumbfounded. Even swordsman Tiangang and swordsman Firmament were agitated and speechless. For a moment, the entire Shushan fell into a deathly silence, but then there was a hysterical explosion. Impossible! 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 Swordsman Tain, who had always been gentle, was like a roaring lion. His face was distorted as he roared. This is impossible. Absolutely impossible. Swordsman Guanchang's eyes were dull, and he kept repeating, "How could this be? How could this be? How did he do it? How did he do it?" The scholarly swordsman Xiaozi also opened his mouth wide at this moment. The great immortal heaven manifestation sword formation of Shushan actually turned around, and turned into the sword formation of the master of the celestial sect. But why is this happening? Swordsman Xiaoyang, who had always been calm, was trembling all over. It doesn't make sense. Even if he used the sect-returning scabbard fragment to attack the sword formation, even if he could destroy it and break it, how could he turn the great immortal heaven manifestation sword formation of Shushan into his own in an instant? The Shushan sword cultivators had always been arrogant, but if someone could break the great immortal heaven manifestation sword formation, although they were unhappy, they would not deny it. Because someone had actually done it. That was the greatest disaster in the history of the Shushan sword sect before today. During a war between the two worlds in the Middle Era, the Extreme Emperor's Divine Abyss, one of the three strongest saint emperors in the history of the demon race, had once completely broken through the great immortal heavens manifestation sword formation, and killed the founder of Mount Shu, sword ancestor Ren Changmei. But Ji Huang Xinyuan had only broken the formation by force. How could he have seized control of the great immortal heaven manifestation sword formation in an instant like today? Especially when Lin Feng and the sky-crushing sword had seized control of the great immortal heaven manifestation sword formation from their archenemy of the Shushan sword path. What was most difficult for them to accept was that they did not even understand how Lin Feng had done it. In the process of seizing control, the tens of thousands of swords that had originally prostrated themselves under the immortal heavenly sword and followed its lead had turned to the sky-crushing sword without hesitation. They had abandoned the immortal heavenly sword and Shushan sword as if they were worn-out shoes, and had even turned to look at them as enemies. This made them feel depressed and at a loss. Everything in the past seemed to have become fake at this moment. The entire Shushan sword sect was filled with wails as they looked at what was happening in front of them in disbelief. The Shushan sword cultivators with low levels of cultivation only had confusion and fear in their eyes. They did not know what to do and felt as if something in their minds had fallen to the ground and shattered. As for the Yuanying sword cultivators who had reached the nascent soul realm, they were shaking their heads in pain. They felt as if their worldview had collapsed and the world around them had become unreal, as if they were in a nightmare. The Yuanying sword cultivators could not stop their Yuanying from leaving their bodies. The Yuanying sword cultivators' bodies were dim and filled with terrifying cracks like broken porcelain. Some nascent soul sword cultivators' bodies were constantly changing between their nascent soul incarnations and human forms, and were almost out of control. Xian Longxing's complexion was similarly ashen. The light in his eyes flickered incessantly. It had already been countless years, and he had never felt like he was today. He felt as if he couldn't control his state of mind, and many distracting thoughts came one after another. Unexpectedly, a thought popped up in his mind. If junior brother Jie were to see this scene, I'm afraid that his originally unstable heart of the sword would completely shatter. His body suddenly trembled as his eyes moved back and forth between the sky-crushing sword, Lin Feng, and the immortal heaven sword before finally stopping on the sky-crushing sword. Could it be? Could it be? But how is this possible? While Shushan was in chaos, a voice suddenly came from the huge and vicious sword formation. Kill. Tun. The voice paused between each word. It was cold and had a slightly cold metallic texture, but it was the pleasant voice of a young girl. After these two words, there was no other sound. The huge sword formation below was filled with vicious energy. The huge sword formation with a blood-red center and a black periphery was right below Sword Sovereign Tiangang and the Immortal Heaven Sword. Originally, the Immortal Heaven Sword was still gathering the sword energy from the Great Immortal Universe sword formation. However, at this moment, it was wrapped up by the monstrous vicious energy. The sword formation below and Jade Jing Mountain firmly held the Immortal Heaven Sword in place. Now, even if Sword Sovereign Tiangang and everyone on Shushan sacrificed their lives, they would not be able to let the Immortal Heaven Sword escape. The Permitha Bridge rushed out of the sky-crushing sword formation and landed above Jade Jing Mountain. Together with Jade Jing Mountain, the Bell of Creation, and the Yinyang Life and Death formation, it suppressed Sword Sovereign Tiangang and the Immortal Heaven Sword. Without the power of the Great Immortal Universe sword formation, the main peak of Shu Mountain had not run out of sword intent and sword energy. Although Sword Sovereign Firmament, Xian Longsheng, and other great sword cultivators continued to help, Shu Mountain and the Immortal Heaven Sword were inevitably at a disadvantage. Lin Feng's figure flashed and appeared inside the sky-crushing sword formation. He reached out and grabbed the hilt of the sky-crushing sword. His expression was calm. Shu Mountain Sword Sect, receive my sky-crushing sword formation. Not only the black and white divine light of creation, but also Lin Feng's own divine art and dharma power were all turned into sky-crushing sword energy and merged with the sky-crushing sword. His mind was connected to the treasures of Jade Jing Mountain. Rays of light descended and strengthened the sky-crushing sword. As the tip of the sword moved, the sky-crushing sword formation turned into a vast expanse of black light that engulfed the world. The hostility of the entire vast thousand worlds condensed like never before, turning into a peerless sword that could destroy the world and pointed directly at the Immortal Heaven Sword. In the spiritual senses of the spectators, they were in a trance. The huge white jade sword that the entire world had turned into disappeared, and was replaced by an equally huge blood-red sword. For a moment, they felt as if the entire world had turned into this blood-red sword. The tip of the sword was pointing at the Immortal Heaven Sword, which had nowhere to retreat to. Sword Sovereign Firmament closed his eyes and slowly opened them again. His entire body turned into a stream of light and merged with the Immortal Heaven Sword. He and the sword became one, activating the last sword energy contained in the main peak of Shu Mountain to meet the attack. At this moment, all the swords in the world changed sides and merged into the vast hostility of the world. Together, they attacked the supreme swordsman of the past, the Supreme Emperor. In the Battle of West Hill, when the Immortal Heaven Sword appeared, it was like the Emperor who controlled all the swords in the world. All the land in the world belonged to the Emperor. When the Emperor gave an order, all the subjects would obey. In front of him, all the existences that could be called swords in the divine land had to bow their heads. There was only one exception. It was the sky-crushing sword. At that time, the sky-crushing sword was like a traitor, arrogantly and decisively facing the high and mighty Immortal Heaven Sword. Was it a traitor, or was it only pure when the entire world was dirty? Even when the entire world was my enemy, I had nothing to fear. The majesty of the Emperor was not to be feared, and the criticism of the masses was not to be feared either. But today, the situation was completely reversed. The rolling tide swept across. All the swords that had been subdued in the past rose up. Wherever the sky-crushing sword went, all the swords in the world would obey, wanting to overthrow the high and mighty emperor of the past. The blood-red sword formed by the world suddenly slashed at the Immortal Heaven Sword. The strong light spread in all directions, covering all directions. All the spectators could see nothing but endless sword light in their divine senses. Chapter 884. The sword radiance was endless, covering the sky and covering the earth. All the spectators felt a stinging pain in their divine senses, and didn't dare to continue watching. Dao Master Thundercloud, Longevity Heavenly Spear, and the others who were close to the battle all retreated quickly to avoid being affected by the collision. A large amount of the realm power between heaven and earth collapsed. Huge, twisted, chaotic cracks spread out like a dense spider web, emitting dazzling brilliance. It was as if a world of creation had completely collapsed and disintegrated into nothingness. After a long time, the sword radiance dissipated. Everyone looked carefully and held their breath. Although they had vaguely guessed it, they were still shocked to see it with their own eyes. Sword Master Heavenly Dipper stood alone in the void. There were several severe wounds on his body and countless great Tao essence scattered. He was seriously injured. But the biggest change compared to before was that there was a faint lethargy on his body, which had never been seen before. It was as if a person had suddenly aged, or as if a cold, sharp sword had gradually decayed and lost its sharpness. He was still holding the Divine Heaven sword in his hand, but the white jade sword that had been bowed to by thousands of swords in the past was now only half left. The Divine Heaven sword, was broken. The former Emperor of Swords was cut in half by another divine sword. The first half of the sword where the sword tip was disappeared, completely vanishing from the world, turning into nothingness, no longer existing. Everything calmed down. The vast divine land was silent for a moment. But soon, a clear sword chime sounded in the surroundings. The sword chime came from the gate of the Heavenly Sword Sect. Then, there seemed to be a bright sword radiance shining in the mountain. It wasn't a real sword radiance. It seemed to be flickering in people's divine senses. But the sword radiance grew brighter and brighter, emitting a high-spirited aura. Sword Master Heavenly Dipper, Old Sword Immortal, and the other sword cultivators drew their swords and held them in front of their chests. They said respectfully in the direction of Shu Mountain, "Thank you, Master of the Taoist sect, for inviting the immortal heaven to perish with a sword from beyond the heavens." Sword Master Heavenly Dipper roared and manifested his void return Dharma form. Endless great Tao entered his body from the sky. The surging sword radiance pierced through the sky and gradually condensed into a light shadow in the shape of a fruit. At the gate of the Thunderbolt Sword Sect, there was also illusory sword radiance and sword intent. The two sword cultivators also held their swords in front of their chests and charged in the direction of Shu Mountain. Master of the Taoist sect, for inviting the immortal heaven to perish with a sword from beyond the heavens. Sword Venerable Flowing Light, who was on Yujing Mountain, Sword Venerable Brilliant of the Sun and Moon Sword Sect, Sword Venerable Constellation of the Constellation Sword Sect, and Sword Venerable of the Great Wilderness of the Wilderness of the Wilderness of the Sword Sect, almost at the same time, made the same action. Master of the Taoist sect, for inviting the immortal heaven to perish with a sword from beyond the heavens. Even the great sword cultivators of the Songhai Sword Sect, such as Venerable Sword Emerald Wave and Venerable Sword Listener, who were guarding the mountain gate, had complicated expressions on their faces. They held their swords in front of their chests and faced Mount Shu. "Thank you, Master of the Celestial Sect of Wonders. With a sword from beyond the heavens, I invite the celestial realm to perish." On Yujing Mountain, beside Wang Lin, the Xiantian God Sealing flag fluttered in the wind. Two light shadows of Essence Soul cultivators appeared on the flag. One was Master of the Songhai Sword Sect, the other was Master of the Blaze Sword Sect, the other was Master of the Blaze Sword Sect. The two sighed at the same time. Master of the Taoist sect, for inviting the immortal heaven to perish with a sword from beyond the heavens. In the sky above Shu Mountain, countless lights flickered, disappeared, and then flickered again. The cycle repeated, as if there were countless streams of light surging between heaven and earth. There were many invisible chains breaking. Resonating with it, the sound of swords humming and sword radiance filled every part of the divine land. The sword humming became louder, and the sword radiance became brighter and brighter, together creating a heavenly phenomenon. In the void, beside Master of the Dipper Sword, Master of the Firmament Sword gradually appeared. He was also heavily injured. With a wave of his hand, a group of Shu Mountain sword cultivators appeared in a sword realm. Everyone stared at the broken immortal heaven sword, dumbfounded as if they were petrified. Almost all the swords that the Shu Mountain sword cultivators carried with them were broken, with only half of them remaining. Only Master of the Dipper Sword, Master of the Firmament Sword, and Exai and Longxing looked at the strange phenomenon in the sky above them in a daze. Then they looked down together. There, a terrifying will had officially awakened. The entire world was shaking. There was even a faint glow of the great Tao in the space, as if it was trembling for this existence that had truly come into being. In the center of the huge sky-punishing sword formation, Lin Feng stood calmly. He raised a long sword in his right hand and pointed it at the sky. The sky-punishing sword in his hand had finally shed the last bit of rust. It had been completely honed. A peerless divine sword had finally truly descended into this vast thousand domains. On Jade Capital Mountain, the huge sword box that had originally belonged to the sky-punishing sword shattered and turned into ashes. In the dark Heaventime light cave, the sloppy old man, who did not care about anything and was playing chess by himself, suddenly trembled. The chess piece in his hand fell onto the chessboard, messing up the game. The old man looked in the direction of the dark Heaventime light cave and fell into a long daze. At this moment, the originally blood-red blade of the sky-punishing sword no longer had any luster. The mournful blood-red light had dissipated, leaving only the surface of the blade with a chaotic and blurry color. It was as if everything had come to an end and creation had come to an end, turning into nothingness. It was like the home of all things. Everything returned to nirvana. Time, space, matter, spiritual chi, and spirit were all annihilated without a trace. It was like the sword of the end, the sword of destruction. Before it, all things were being destroyed. All things had come to an end. The terrifying sword will and the aura of the artistic conception made everyone shudder. This is like a creation magic treasure, but it is not the creation magic treasure that the great heaven world knows about. There is a magical technique that contains the power of destruction. It can be called a Tao-destroying technique, but it is only a trace. This sword can be said to be a true Tao annihilation sword. Although this sword has been completely sharpened, it seems that there is still a possibility of improvement. Lin Feng raised the sword. The vicious aura of heaven and earth was the tip, soaring into the sky like a pillar of air. At the center of the pillar of air, the sky was instantly torn open. Streams of air spiraled like a huge whirlpool. The whirlpool rapidly expanded into the surroundings, vaguely occupying the entire sky. The entire great heaven world was shaking slightly. The creation magic treasure closest to the sky-punishing sword, the Permitha Bridge, was shaking nonstop. Countless images appeared, and rays of golden light fell. A grand will was manifested from it, but it revealed a deep fear towards the sky-punishing sword. At the border of the Great Zhou Empire and the Great Qin Empire, the three great creation magic treasures, the Immortal Dragon City, the Grand Imperial Palace, and the Great Celestial Wheel, also shook at the same time. The Immortal Dragon City turned into a flowing river of time, shining brightly and spanning across the sky. There seemed to be countless people standing on the river, supporting the Great Wall together. In the middle of the crowd, the spirit of Emperor Qin was faintly discernible. The wills of the many people gathered together to form a grand will. That was the will of the Immortal Dragon City. However, at this moment, the Immortal Dragon City also revealed a sense of fear towards the Sword of Rebirth in the distance. The magic treasure spirit of the creation magic treasure was usually in harmony with the heaven and earth. It was like the will of creation, and it wouldn't be revealed easily. However, at this moment, not only the Immortal Dragon City and the Permitha Bridge, but also the Grand Imperial Palace and the Great Celestial Wheel revealed an indistinct but incomparably huge will. They stared at the divine sword that gathered the vicious aura of heaven and earth with vigilance and fear. In a dimensional realm, the king of the underworld, who looked like a 2- or 3-year-old child, expressionlessly looked at the book of life and death in his hand, which was constantly flipping pages. He could feel the sense of fear coming from the book of life and death. In the distant, desolate, ancient sea of stars, there seemed to be a wave of fluctuation. It seemed that the will of creation had awakened. The boundaries of the southern wastelands suddenly collapsed, and a crack appeared in the netherworld sea. Thousands of calamities and tribulations wreaked havoc in the netherworld sea. There seemed to be a giant opening his eyes, and gazing in the direction of Mount Shu. In the divine land, above the White Cloud Mountain where the Taishu Temple was located, the sea of white clouds that surrounded the mountain all year round suddenly dispersed, and a light and shadow appeared on the mountain peak. There was nothing else in the light and shadow except for a circular existence that looked like the surface of a mirror. As soon as the mirror light appeared, the entire divine land seemed to have stopped. Everything and everyone fell into a state of stillness. Their own image appeared on the mirror, but it wasn't moving. It was like a static picture scroll. Lin Feng held the heaven-punishing sword in his hand. His gaze pierced through the endless void and calmly looked at the round mirror on the top of the white cloud mountain. The sword edge formed by the evil aura of heaven and earth was illuminated by the mirror light and showed signs of disintegration. However, the chaotic and blurry sword light on the heaven-punishing sword changed direction, and the world-destroying sword will soared into the sky. The heaven and earth were the sword, and the evil aura was the tip. That terrifying sword will condensed again. A long sigh came from the void. Master of the celestial sect, why did you have to do this? On the top of the white cloud mountain, the current head of the Taishu temple, Yin Nanlai, looked at Lin Feng with a complicated expression on his face. The mirror light and the sword will clashed. Suddenly, invisible bands of light appeared on the surface of the boundless universe. As if the spirit sea had descended. The light disappeared in a flash. Several figures landed on the top of the white cloud mountain and came to Yin Nanlai's side. It was Lord Tai and the others who had finally broken free from the suppression of the spirit sea. Everyone's expression was bright and dark, and their gazes were complicated. Shoichi Dashin stared at the heaven-punishing sword in Lin Feng's hand. This ominous sword has finally been completely born. It's not fate, but it's better than fate. Although the damage to the Haotian mirror has yet to recover, this is the first magic treasure in the Tianyuan world that dares to face the Haotian mirror directly. Lord Tai closed his eyes and also looked at the heaven-punishing sword. Then his gaze swept across Yujing Mountain, the Bell of Fate, the Golden Permitha Bridge, and the Yin and Yang formation of life and death. Finally, it stopped on Lin Feng and he also sighed. Master of the celestial sect, why did you have to do this? Lin Feng calmly met the eyes of the big shots of the Void Temple, indifferently saying, even though I don't completely agree with your sect's conduct in the vast divine continent, but your sect, no matter if it's the conservative or radical faction, all resolutely resist the demon race and protect the vast divine continent. I express my appreciation. However, blindly suppressing conflicts will not solve them. When they are suppressed to the extreme, they will only explode more violently and cause more trouble in the future. Instead, it will damage the overall situation. Respecting the overall situation does not mean that the overall situation can protect the weak. The world's justice is the true overall situation. Justice is in the hearts of the people, and the hearts of the people are the foundation of the overall situation. Today the Zhu family owes me, Xianmen Tianzong, justice. I will naturally get it back. Golden Cicada kidnapped my grand disciple. Once this is over, the first thing I will do is go to the vast land of infinite wasteland to find trouble with him. If your sect insists that my killing and capturing of the weak today has damaged the strength of the human race, then it's simple, Lin Feng said lightly. When I go to the vast land of infinite wasteland, I will just kill more great demons. Chapter 885. Lin Feng looked at Taiwan Master and the others at the top of White Cloud Mountain. Heaven and earth fell into silence. After a long time, Taiwan Master slowly shook his head. Master of Xianmen sect, your sword is very ominous. Its sword intent is to destroy and slaughter everything. If it continues to improve, it will be the real destruction of the world. I'm afraid you will also be hurt. Lin Feng smiled faintly. Taiwan Master, thank you for worrying too much. I know my sword well. After saying this, Lin Feng loosened his right hand and let go of the sky-crushing sword. With a thought, the sky-crushing sword rose up. The sky-crushing sword formation under his feet flashed. Thousands of swords flew out and left the sword formation. Like a rain of flowers, they scattered among the peaks of Mount Shu below. These swords were now completely restored to their original state, but the luster on the blades was different from before. Some of the swords fell directly into the mountains and rivers, while most of them turned into streams of light and scattered in all directions. The blood-red pillar of qi in the center of the sky-crushing sword formation had disappeared and completely integrated into the sword formation. The huge sword formation flashed with black sword light, and its murderous aura was shocking. There was no longer a single black sword light in the sword formation. Instead, the murderous aura of heaven and earth gathered and turned into thousands of black swords of qi, threatening the divine land. The river of time that was originally wrapped around Yujing Mountain fell down, and once again transformed into the appearance of the Bell of Creation. A boy about 5 or 6 years old stood beside the Bell of Creation and bowed towards Lin Feng. "Creation greets Master," Lin Feng said. "You can continue to temper the sky-crushing sword with this sword formation. Follow my secret method. In the future, you and the sword formation can advance together with the sky-crushing sword." The Fate Creation boy looked at the murderous sky-crushing sword with some fear. He stuck out his tongue and said, "As you command, old master." The sky-crushing sword shook a little. A shadow flashed beside the sword and gradually turned into a woman. It was Xianli, but the current Xianli had changed a little compared to her 17 or 18 years old appearance. She was still beautiful and even more elegant, but she looked older than 20 years old. She was 22 or 23 years old. His hair, which was originally half black and half white, didn't seem to have changed at first glance, but if one were to look closely, they would feel that it was like the blade of the heaven-punishing sword, chaotic and blurry, mysterious and unfathomable. Xianli's long-cherished wish had been fulfilled by cutting the immortal heaven sword. She seemed to be in good spirits, but her beautiful face was still expressionless. She was like a cold and exquisite puppet. Only when she looked at Lin Feng did her eyes move slightly, as if there was a light flickering in them. Lin Feng smiled and flicked his finger on the blade of the Sky Destroyer. A soft sound came from the blade, shaking the void. "Cultivate well." Xianli pursed her lips and nodded stiffly. She reached out and grabbed the Sky Destroyer sword. Lin Feng clapped his hands lightly, and the huge Sky Destroyer sword formation below rose. Fate Creation Boy and the Bell of Fate combined and manifested the first phenomenon, the Life Creation Gate. The pitch-black gate opened, and a vast white qi of creation gushed out from it. It blended with the black qi rising from the Sky Destroyer sword formation, and formed a long qi pillar. The black and white qi pillar wrapped around Xianli and the Sky Destroyer sword. Xianli sat cross-legged in the middle of the two qi pillars, and the Sky Destroyer sword was placed horizontally on her knees. Slowly, she closed her eyes. Lin Feng's hands kept changing the Dharma seals, and streams of Dharma power were injected into the black and white qi pillar. Slowly, the black and white qi pillar rose into the sky. The sky opened, revealing the dark void. Slowly, the black and white qi pillar rose into the void and disappeared. Lin Feng looked at everyone in Taishu Temple and said calmly, "Previously, Dao Lord Qingyi had projected himself to my Xianmen Tianzong for a short period of time. Your sect's Haotian mirror seems to be paying attention to other places. I suppose there's some movement in Heaven Wasteland?" Back then, Heaven Enchantress and Golden Rock had obtained a portion of Yudu Minghua in Cloud Forest Realm. If they could gain the experience of Yuhuang's Celestial Sea, they might sense the strange changes that your sect and I experienced, and thus incite the demons to create chaos. I'll be making a trip to Heaven Wasteland soon. There might be a chance for us to work together. Although he had used the Heaven Punishment Sword formation and the Bell of Fate to seal the Heaven Punishment Sword, it was to further strengthen the Heaven Punishment Sword, the Bell of Fate, and the Heaven Punishment Sword formation. The temporary dormancy was for long-term progress in the future. If there was a need, he could just unseal it in advance. At most, he wouldn't be able to do everything, and he would have to start all over again. After saying that, Lin Feng's feet paused slightly, and he was already on Jade Capital Mountain. He put away the Permitha Golden Bridge and the Life and Death formation, and the mysterious Heaven Treasure Tree at the top of the mountain spread its branches and leaves, breaking through the void and escaping inside. Lin Feng didn't make things difficult for the people of Shu Mountain. Although Sword Venerable Guanchong, Sword Venerable Shaozi, and Sword Venerable Taiyin had also participated in the siege of Xianmen Tianzong, they were already half-crippled by Xiao Yan and Shi Tianhao, so Lin Feng wasn't interested in continuing to bicker with them. The people of Shu Mountain were either at a loss, fearful, or hateful as they watched Lin Feng and Jade Capital Mountain disappear, but they didn't dare to say anything. There were those who would rather die in glory than live in dishonor. However, they saw that the three big shots of their sect were all in a daze, and they had no intention of fighting to the death with Lin Feng. Xian Longsheng, Sword Venerable Tiangang, and Sword Venerable Firmament all had complicated expressions at this moment. They looked at the broken immortal heaven sword in silence. Although all of them were seriously injured, they didn't cower in fear. Instead, their expressions were very strange. They seemed to be crying and laughing at the same time. And they seemed to be in a daze and at the same time enlightened. All of them were deep in thought. The turbulent Shu Mountain had disappeared at this moment, leaving behind only loneliness. At the top of White Cloud Mountain, the people of Taishu Temple watched the sky-crushing sword, Lin Feng, and Jade Capital Mountain disappear into the void one after another. None of them spoke. The circular mirror above the top of the mountain had already disappeared, and the clouds around White Cloud Mountain thickened once again, covering the entire mountain and making no sound at all. Among the white clouds, Shoichi Daishin stood at the top of the mountain and said calmly, "Let's first stabilize the situation in Tianhuang and vast land before we discuss in detail." Grand One's Supremacy sighed softly, nodded, and disappeared from the top of the mountain with Shoichi Daishin. Yin Nanlai's body didn't move, but his hands changed hand seals continuously. On White Cloud Mountain, a faintly discernible mirror light seemed to have passed through the boundary between the two worlds, and was currently shining on a certain place in Tianhuang and vast land. As Yin Nanlai moved, the mirror light became brighter, and its aura became more profound. The power of the boundary became thinner, but it didn't really collapse, and the mirror light passed through it. Xianlin Taoist and Kai Fengzhou stepped forward together. The formation-breaking drum and the void yin-yang bell also appeared in front of them, and the two people and two treasures disappeared together. Yun Yuanjin, Dao Venerable Yu Yuan, and Lin Daohan continued to stay at the top of White Cloud Mountain, standing together with Yin Nanlai. Everyone was silent. After a long time, the bright mirror light gradually calmed down a little. Grand One Supremacy's figure reappeared at the top of White Cloud Mountain. He gently flicked his finger at the bright mirror light, and the mirror light immediately split into many rays of light that escaped into the void. The next moment, many light figures appeared in front of Grand One Supremacy and the others. They weren't real people, but dermic power projections. Among the three people in front, one was Shoichi Daishin, who had just left with Grand One Supremacy. The other was a cold girl who looked only 13 or 14 years old. And the last was a handsome young man who looked about 20 years old. The latter two were the other two of the four elders of Great Void, Dao Venerable Qing Yi and Dao Venerable Xian Yi. Shoichi Daishin and Dao Venerable Qing Yi's original bodies were currently in Tianhuang and vast land. Dao Venerable Xian Yi had just experienced the degeneration tribulation and was recuperating in seclusion. There were a few people behind Shoichi Daishin and the other two. The person on the far right was a child with a serene expression and eyes that seemed to have seen the vicissitudes of life. He was Quang Heng, who hadn't shown himself since the Battle of West Hill City. Like Dao Venerable Xian Yi, he had just experienced a degeneration tribulation and was recuperating. Beside Quang Heng were Xianlin Taoist and Kai Fengzhou, who had just gone to Tianhuang and vast land with him. There were two other people. One was a middle-aged man in white with a calm expression. He was another member of Taishu Temple's Grand Supreme Elders Association, a conservative big shot, Fu Yinkong. The other person looked to be a young man that was in high spirits and carried a slightly arrogant aura. He was a member of the Supreme Elder Association of the Void Temple along with Fu Yinkong, Lord Xianlin, and the others, a big shot of the radical faction Wu Mingqi. Previously, he and Fu Yinkong had been guarding Tianhuang and vast land together. Beside them stood a light shadow of an old man who looked vaguely agitated. He was another conservative Grand Supreme Elder, Dao Venerable Qing Ning, the top alchemist of Taishu Temple. He had been refining a furnace of important elixirs in seclusion, and didn't even have time to come out of seclusion due to the incident in Tianhuang and vast land. Just when he had some free time, he was directly summoned by the Haotian mirror's dermic projection. Two tall figures appeared beside Dao Venerable Qing Ning. They were not dermic projections, but real people. One was a man and the other was a woman. However, although they were in human form, they had two dragon horns on their foreheads. The leaders of Taishu Temple's Grand Supreme Dragon Pool, Blackscale Dragon King and Huiyun Dragon King, were conservative and radical respectively. In addition to Temple Master Yan Nanlai, Dao Venerable Tai, Shoichi Dashan, Dao Venerable Qingyi, Dao Venerable Xian, Kuang Heng, Xianlin Taoist Wu Mingqi Fu Yun Kong, Yun Yuanzhen, Dao Venerable Yu Yuan Kai Fengzhou, and Dao Venerable Qing Ning formed the Grand Supreme Elders Association of Taishu Temple. Blackscale Dragon King, Huiyun Dragon King, and Lin Daohan had the right to listen in. Dao Venerable Qing Ning frowned and asked, "Uncle Tai, why do you want to hold another meeting? Is the exploration of the spiritual sea blocked?" Lin Daohan succinctly and clearly told him what had happened in the spiritual sea, the incident at Yujing Mountain, and the battle on Mount Shu. After he finished, Yan Nanlai flicked his finger at the Haotian mirror. A ball of light and shadow appeared and completely replayed the entire battle after Lin Feng returned to the infinite Kiliacosm. All of a sudden, those who didn't know what was going on fell silent. Shoichi Dashan's Dharma power projection looked around and said calmly, "Today, Xianmen Tianzong has finally become powerful." Dao Venerable Xian Yi looked at the light and shadow reflected in the Haotian mirror and said slowly, "The master of Xianmen Tianzong himself, Yujing Mountain, the yin and yang life and death formation, the ominous sword that was finally completely cast, the sword formation that he used for his own use, and the Dharma treasure that proved the way. Among all the beings who have entered the ancient era, I'm afraid that only the Haotian mirror in its perfect state, Yudu of the Heavenly Ocean, the Zhenhou that was killed after challenging the throne of Yudu of the Heavenly Ocean, and senior brother Tai, who was uninjured 4,600 years ago, can defeat him. If he can survive the calamity of creation and the collapse of the great Tao, or if his sword and bell improve greatly again, I'm afraid he'll really become another Yudu of the Heavenly Ocean." Shoichi Dashan said indifferently, "Even with his current strength, before the Haotian mirror returns to its peak, we won't be able to control him and Xianmen Tianzong anymore, unless we start an all-out war. And if they started an all-out war, it would most likely result in one death and one injury, or both sides would suffer heavy losses." Everyone in the Taishu Temple fell silent for a moment, not saying a word. It had been far too long. It had been many years since a human force that could compete with the Taishu Temple on its own had appeared. But today, there was finally a chess piece that jumped out of the chessboard and transformed into a chess player that was worthy of attention, standing in front of the Taishu Temple. From now on, the situation in the Divine Land would no longer be the same. Chapter 886. Everyone in the Taishu Temple turned to look at Taoist Lord Tai. Taoist Lord Tai turned his head to look at Shoichi Dashan and the others. He sighed again and did not say much. He said simply, "There are ways to defeat him, but it will be very difficult to kill him. We can only try to trap him. I can use the collapse of the great Tao to die with him." Hearing this, none of the big shots in the Taishu Temple looked happy. Instead, their expressions darkened. Slowly, Taoist Lord Tai said, "I hope he is not another king of the underworld, another ruthless emperor, or another primordial demon master." Taoist Lord Qingyi said calmly, "No one can guarantee that. It would be fine if we fight on White Cloud Mountain. But if we fight outside of White Cloud Mountain, unless the Haotian mirror is complete, we will have to send many people to trap him." Kai Fengzhou said, "But in that case, the master of the celestial sect will still have the power to fight back. More than half of the people we trap will die with him." Kuang Heng said calmly, "The Haotian mirror is complete. We don't need Uncle Taoist Lord Tai to die with us." Yin Yuanzhen sighed. "It will take time for the Haotian mirror to return to its peak. The master of the celestial sect will also need time to refine his heaven-punishing sword again. I'm afraid he did it to deal with the Haotian mirror of our temple." Wu Mingqi frowned. "This person's ambition is not small. Let's see who is faster." A strange light flashed in his eyes. His pupils seemed to reflect the thousands of calamities in the netherworld ocean. Kai Fengzhou looked at Wu Mingqi and did not say anything. The two of them were from the same sect. They were both descendants of Wen Qiyang, the head of the Great Void Four. Unfortunately, they had different stances. One was conservative, and the other was radical. Kai Fengzhou said, "Once the Haotian mirror is used, the recovery will be delayed." Dao Master Qing Ning, who was also a conservative, calmly said, "Let's give the master of the celestial sect a chance to unsheath his sword. Just make sure that it's used against the demon clan." Kai Fengzhou sighed and said, "The situation in the divine land will be different from now on." Quang Heng said calmly, "Another heavenly gate. We will deal with it the same way our ancestors dealt with the heavenly gate. At that time, our Taishu temple was in an unprecedented downturn. Now the situation is much better." Fu Yinkong remained silent for a while, then said, "No one can guarantee that the master of the Xian Gate won't be another ruthless king, but it doesn't mean that he will definitely become the enemy of our divine land. From what I've seen, this man is cruel and tough, but he is completely different from the likes of the king of the underworld, the ruthless king, and the original devil master. If this man succeeds in the future, he may become another pillar of the human clan." Silently, Yin Nanlai said, "Our temple follows the teachings of our ancestors. Our priority is to support the divine land. Even if we exercise checks and balances, it is only a means, not the end. If the master of the Xian Gate rises and becomes stronger than us, he will be able to protect the vast 1,000 domains and fight against the demon clan. Isn't that a good thing?" His eyes swept across Quang Heng, Xianlin Taoist, and Wu Mingqi. Silently, Quang Heng and the other two looked at him calmly, not backing down. On the contrary, Dao Master Yi Yuan, who belonged to the same conservative camp as him and Fu Yinkong, said coldly, "It is too early to say these things. Our Taishu temple has been through the test of time since ancient times. As for the master of the Xian Gate, it remains to be seen." Yin Nanlai and Fu Yinkong nodded and said, "That is true. Let's see the master of the Xian Gate's actions and results in this trip to Infinite Wasteland." Dao Master Tai closed his eyes and said with a gentle expression, "If there are any bad signs, I will sacrifice myself and strike like lightning. Otherwise, if things continue to develop, we will no longer be able to control them." Everyone nodded. The figures of the people who had come with their spiritual power gradually disappeared from the top of the mountain. White Cloud Mountain returned to peace and silence. At this moment, on Yujing Mountain, Lin Feng strolled leisurely on the top of the mountain with his hands behind his back. He walked to the mysterious sky treasure tree, where everyone bowed to him. "Welcome back, Master. Welcome back, Sect Master. Welcome back, Master of the Xian Gate." After Swordsman Flowing Light bowed to Lin Feng, he bowed even more seriously and solemnly. He repeated what he had said before. "Thank you, Master of the Xian Gate, for inviting the immortal sky to perish with a sword from beyond the heavens." Lin Feng did not wait for him to bow and gave him a slight push, stopping his movements. He smiled faintly and said, "I sent the immortal sky to perish to settle the grudge between me and Shushan. You don't have to thank me." Lin Feng looked at him and saw that there was a strange flowing light faintly flickering on Swordsman Flowing Light's body. His sword will was bursting. If he sensed it carefully, he would discover that it was the Celeritas Sword Sect's instant flowing light sword way, but compared to before, it was a level higher. At this moment, his sword way had improved. Although it was just a bud and needed to be carefully analyzed and comprehended, he could already see that it was not the slightest bit weaker than Shushan's Shaozi sword tool. In fact, it was even stronger than before. Moreover, it was not like before where he could not find a path. A clear path of great Tao had appeared in front of him, and there was still profound potential to be unearthed in the future. Swordsman Flowing Light's expression was also a little complicated. He turned to look at the mysterious Sky God sealing banner that Wang Lin was controlling. Light and shadow swayed on the surface of the banner, and two figures appeared. These two figures had lifeless expressions at this moment. They were Shushan's Swordsman Little Shang and Swordsman Fiercely. Swordsman Little Shang was not as ostentatious and domineering as he was in the past, and Swordsman Fiercely was no longer cold and murderous. At this moment, their expressions were incomparably complicated. The light in their eyes flickered, as if it could be extinguished at any moment. The images of Swordsman Vast Sea and Swordsman Fierce Fire also appeared on the mysterious Sky God Sealing banner. The two of them cultivated the Vast Sea Swordway and the Raging Inferno Swordway respectively. Just like Swordsman Flowing Light's Instant Flowing Light Swordway, they faintly felt that the path ahead of them had suddenly become clear. Swordsman Fierce Fire was silent, while Swordsman Vast Sea sighed softly. In the past, I only felt that I was powerless against the Shushan Immortal Sky Sword, but I didn't know the reason. It was only in the instant when the Immortal Sky perished that I understood what was going on. Swordsman Flowing Light gazed at Swordsman Little Shang, shook his head, and sighed. It's the same for everyone. Nowadays, most of the sword Daros in the world originated from Shushan, or perhaps they studied the swords of Shushan when they were first established. As a result, they took fewer detours, but in the end they cut off their own future, and can no longer turn back. Emperor of Swords, Emperor of Swords. Hehe, which emperor doesn't impose harsh taxes? Which emperor allows his subjects to proclaim themselves kings and start their own business? The Immortal Sky Sword has been spreading its sword will since it was still in its embryonic stage. Then it gathered the sword will of all the swords in the world that were born because of it, forming a cycle. It established the opportunity to achieve creation, and finally, it was completely refined. Our ancestors took the bait willingly. Once they entered the cycle, they couldn't get out. Between us and Shushan, it's hard to tell if it's a favor or a grudge. Hearing this, Lin Feng did not say anything, not willing to take the bait, and wanting to walk on their own. Other than the already strong few like the Void Temple and Elysium, the majority of them have been dissolved into nothingness by Shushan. Of the countless swords in the great immortal heavens thousand phenomenon sword formation, only a small portion are Shushan's. Rather than calling it a sword array, it was more like a sword prison or a sword tomb. The ancient Heavenly Gate and the Grand Jiutian Divine Sword died early, while the Taishu Temple's Sword Daos originated from its own Great Tao of the Great Void, which had high requirements for aptitude and was not universal. Under this cycle, the Immortal Sky Sword and Immortal Heaven Sword became stronger and stronger. After the chaotic Middle Era successfully passed the initial primitive accumulation stage, the position of the Emperor of Swords gradually became unshakable, and more people took the bait willingly. As a result, almost all the swords circulating in the Divine Land originated from the Immortal Sky Sword. Venerable Flowing Light sighed. Sect Leader Lin, perhaps you didn't mean to, but you used your sword to destroy the Immortal Heaven, and completely cut off the Immortal Heaven Sword Chi. Otherwise, as long as the sword intent from the Immortal Heaven Sword Chi in the world doesn't dissipate, the Immortal Sky Sword will eventually be completed, and we can only be trapped in this cycle forever. Although Shushan and the Immortal Heaven Sword Chi still exist, without the Immortal Sky Sword, we finally have hope of Dao integration, and can finally improve our sword Daos. The blocked path in the past is now open again. It's all because of your kindness. Lin Feng shook his head. There's no need to say more. We have to walk our own path. On the other hand, I will remember your help. Venerable Flowing Light shook his head. Compared to your kindness, it's nothing. Our sects have always been in contact, so it's only right for me to help. Xiaoyan walked up and said, Master, Mr. Twin Peaks of the Peak was seriously injured while removing the falling rocks for Shushan. You have already killed the enemy, so please help Mr. Twin Peaks of the Peak. Monk Dade was also injured while removing the falling rocks, and he has been fighting with the enemy with his injuries. Lin Feng pointed a finger at the Two Poles Sky Peak. The Two Poles Sky Peak immediately circulated with light. Next, after giving Zen Master Dade a helping hand, Lin Feng turned his head and smiled toward Xiaoyan. You're also not lightly injured. Xiaoyan laughed. Don't laugh at me, Master. I know my injuries well. It's best for me to cultivate and recover on my own. It will help me master the five-colored fire lotus faster. Lin Feng nodded. Not bad, very good. Xiaoyan, you are very good. You have the appearance of an eldest brother. Very good. He turned to look at Zhu Yi Wanglin, Shi Tianhao, and the other disciples. Everyone is very good. I am very happy. Everyone smiled and bowed to Lin Feng again. Master is not here. If there is anything, we should do it. Thank you for your concern. Lin Feng turned to Xiao Zhener and Gu Peng. Thank you for your hard work. Xiao Zhener bowed and said, Senior Lin, you are too kind. My family's medium-class world has also changed. Father and the others can't leave, so only Uncle Peng and I came. Otherwise, if Father could come, the battle at Yujing Mountain wouldn't have been so dangerous. If you didn't come out in time, your heaven-punishing sword might have been stolen by Shushan cultivators. Lin Feng waved his hand and smiled. You are too serious. Send my regards to your father. After everyone bowed to Lin Feng quickly received the news that Purple Cloud Dao's Taoist Master Thundercloud and Taoist Master Blue Thunder, Northern Militant Imperial Court's Longevity Heavenly Spear and High Priest, Thunderbolt Sword Venerable, and Desolate Sword Venerable, had all requested to go up the mountain to congratulate him. Lin Feng was naturally fine with it. Almost at the same time news came. The Zhou Dynasty, Songhai Sword Sect, Blaze Sword Sect as well as the Reincarnation Sect that only has a few big cats left have also come to request a visit. They are undoubtedly here to ransom someone. Chapter 887. After Lin Feng left Shu Mountain, Qin Emperor Shiyu, Zhou Emperor Liang Pan, and Marquis Xuanji Zhu Hongwu were silent at the border of Great Zhou Empire and Great Qin Empire. The cultivators of the two empires were silent for a long time, but both sides started to retreat at the same time. Immortal Dragon City, Grand Imperial Palace, and Great Heaven Wheel all disappeared into the void. The confrontation between the two sides officially ended. Zhu Hongwu landed in Grand Imperial Palace. Liang Pan sat on the dragon throne. Silently he looked at Zhu Hongwu and said, Hongwu, time waits for no man. You need to strive to fuse with the Tao as soon as possible. Yes, Your Majesty. Zhu Hongwu nodded his head, his expression as usual. I also feel that I can't grasp the current situation. The strength that the Master of the Celestial Sect of Wonders has displayed this time is indeed beyond imagination. My great Zhou dynasty should prepare early. That unfilial son of mine actually managed to refine a creation magical treasure. Even if I wanted to teach him a lesson, I wouldn't have complete confidence that I could defeat him. But if I wanted to kill him or capture him, I wouldn't have the confidence that I could. Unless I was willing to use the Great Celestial Wheel to destroy his Permitha Bridge, then trap him and prevent him from escaping, only then would I have a chance of capturing him. Liang Pan said. Not bad. Next, go all out to fuse with the Tao. I'll prepare the Heavenly Grotto Heaven, and the resources you need for time acceleration. You can use them freely. Zhu Hongwu bowed. Thank Your Majesty for your kindness. Liang Pan stood up from the dragon throne. Light and shadow flashed in front of him, and two images appeared. One of them was the Azure Sea Sword Sect's Honorable Swordsman Emerald Wave, Honorable Swordsman Tidewatching, and the other was the only remaining Essence Soul cultivator in Eastern Heaven Gate, Xiao Qingqing. After Xiao Dongtian went to Kunlun Mountain, Xiao Qingqing stayed in the capital of Great Zhou Dynasty, and did not return to the Vermilion Heaven Pagoda. Liang Pan said slowly, Minister Xiao's family and swordsmen of the vast sea are both imprisoned because of the Great Zhou Dynasty. Naturally, I will not mistreat them. Later, someone will go to Yujing Mountain to negotiate and redeem them. You can come with them. When you return, just take whatever you need from the treasury. Azure Sea Sword Venerable and the others bowed. Thank you, Your Majesty. Xiao Qingqing sighed. Your Majesty, I think it's better if I don't go. Otherwise, it might be even more disadvantageous to the negotiations between Great Zhou and Xianmen Tianzong. Lin Feng and Zhu Yi wouldn't deliberately humiliate or make things difficult for her. But if she went, not only would it not show her sincerity, it might even backfire. Liang Mingliang nodded and didn't say anything else. After the light disappeared, he looked into the distance and sighed. Time waits for no man. In the end, the person in charge of heading to Jade Capital Mountain was a Void Return cultivator from the Great Zhou Dynasty. He was a member of the royal family, the Prince of Yanliang, Liang Fu. Among the primordial soul experts of the Great Zhou Dynasty, he was the most mild-tempered one. After all, he was going to Yujing Mountain this time to make amends. When he received the news that everyone had come to visit, Lin Feng smiled faintly. Those who came to congratulate him, and those who came to redeem him, he would let them up the mountain together. When everyone saw each other, they couldn't help but feel slightly awkward. Dao Master Thundercloud and Dao Master Blue Thunder looked at the white-robed young man in front of them. Shen Qifeng, you're actually here? The white-robed young man was the personal disciple of the reincarnation sect Master Shi Tianfang. Dao Master Tiantan, Shen Qifeng. He smiled slightly. I was imprisoned in the heavenly abyss of the Bai sect before. Sect Master Lin raised the mountain gate of the heavenly realm, so I was able to come out. I've always disagreed with the ideas of my master and the others. However, I'm insignificant and I've been sentenced to heavenly abyss, so there's nothing I can do. But after all, I'm an elder of the sect, so I can only shamelessly come here. I hope Sect Master Lin can forgive me. He cupped his hands toward Dao Master Thundercloud and Dao Master Blue Thunder. I'm Wuxia of the Animal Path and Dark Lord of the Hell Path. I've offended you before. Please forgive me. Dao Master Thundercloud looked at him and said in a deep voice, Who do you represent now? The reincarnation sect, or just the heavenly realm? Shen Qifeng replied, Sect Master Mo of the Azura Path is the new sect master of the Bai sect. He's injured and needs to recuperate, so he asked me to come here. The so-called sect master Mo was naturally the sect master of the Azura Path of the reincarnation sect, Mo Shilua. He had been imprisoned by Shi Tianfang before, and was released when Lin Feng wiped out the mountain gate of the heavenly realm. As the only remaining Dao integration expert of the reincarnation sect, he naturally became the new sect master when the reincarnation sect was declining. Shi Tianfang was dead, so Mo Shilua didn't mind uniting others. Moreover, he was more urgent than the great Zhou dynasty. Dao Master Thundercloud didn't say anything more and fell silent. Dao Master Blue Thunder and Shen Qifeng chatted casually. Sword Master of the Thunderbolt, Sword Master of the Great Wilderness, High Priest Bei Rong, Longevity Heavenly Spear, and King Yanliang, Liang Fu of the Great Zhou dynasty stood together. A short while later, people from the Great Qin dynasty also came to congratulate them. The Dao Integration Stage South Bright Monarch Shizongtang and the Return to Void Stage Tranquility Monarch Shizongyue came together. Accompanying them were the Sun Moon Sword Sect's Glorious Sun Sword Venerate and the Star Constellation Sword Venerate. After everyone greeted each other, Thunderbolt Sword Master and Great Wilderness Sword Master looked at Sunshine Sword Master and Constellation Sword Master and sighed. You guys are here too. Sun Luminary Sword Venerable replied. The Master of the Celestial Gate destroyed the Celestial Realm with his sword, allowing our Divine Land's Sword Dao to finally return to the right track. How can such a favor be expressed with a mere visit to the mountain? The Star Constellation Sword Venerable sighed and said, Ever since the founding master, the sages of the past have never understood the reason. Why is it that when our sect's sword arts reach a certain level, it will fall into a shackle that we can't break free from, and the path ahead is completely blocked? Although I had some suspicions before and vaguely felt that it was related to Shu Mountain and the Immortal Heaven Sword, I didn't know why. It wasn't until the Master of the Celestial Gate used his sword to destroy the Immortal Heaven Sword, shattering the invisible shackles and stirring the grand Tao of the world, that I understood the whole story. It's a pity that our ancestors still don't understand and can only sigh at the blocked path ahead. Thunderbolt Sword Venerable snorted. Which sect's founding master isn't like this? The Shu Mountain Sword sect has been harboring evil intentions from the beginning. How could they tell the truth? On one hand, they deceived those who came to seek guidance. On the other hand, they eliminated those who fumbled on their own. In the end, they created the number one sword of heaven's origin. Flowing Light Sword Venerable's figure appeared before them. Silently he said, Shu Mountain harbored evil intentions and used us. However, when our founding masters established the sect, they did study the Shu Mountain Sword Dao in detail. That's why the initial stage was relatively smooth. It's just that the price paid after that was too great. It's hard to say whether it's a blessing or a curse. Thunderbolt Sword Venerable said coldly. What's hard to say? If we knew the truth, who would be stupid enough to learn his sword arts? When the various sects were first established, they all had a good impression of Shu Mountain. They thought that it was broad-minded, willing to share, and like a teacher to the world. If it wasn't for the fact that they gradually felt that Shu Mountain's style was too overbearing and unreasonable, they wouldn't have been so distant from it. It was precisely because of this that they were especially angry after the truth was revealed. Silently, honorable swordsman of the great wilderness said, "If we didn't learn his sword arts and wanted to fumble on our own, the swords of our ancestors would have long been in the great immortal heaven's manifestation sword formation, right? Sometimes ignorance is bliss. We've persevered through the darkest times, and now we're finally welcoming the light." Thunderbolt Sword Venerable said with a sorrowful smile, "If the Xian sect master's heaven-crushing sword hadn't appeared, how long would the dark times have lasted? We don't even know why there's always darkness before our eyes. We've welcomed the light, but what about our ancestors? Our sect's fourth sect master, my great-grandmaster, was a genius. He cultivated our sect's Thunderbolt Sword Dao, and was better than Shushan Sword Venerable of the same generation and cultivation level in sword fights. He was able to fight a great demon of the unity of the stars and souls at the Void Return Realm, and escape unscathed. And the result? He reached the Void Return Realm in 600 years, and was stuck at the peak of the Void Return Realm for over 10,000 years. He suffered in the accelerated time grotto heaven, went in and out of the void battlefield 5 times, went deep into the Ying Ocean to challenge layers of illusions, went deep into the infinite region to kill demons, and took the initiative to enter the void to attract endless thunderbolts to strike himself in order to gain enlightenment. He experienced all kinds of dangers and tribulations for so long, but in the end it was all in vain. In the end he died in the hands of a great demon of the initial tribulation stage in the War of the Two Worlds." Thunderbolt Sword Venerable shook his head with a bitter smile. "Back then, Great Grandmaster was high-spirited and wanted to be the first person of our sect to achieve Dao integration. It's a pity that he didn't understand until his death that all his efforts were in vain." He raised his eyes to look at Flowing Light Swordsman. "If I remember correctly, the founder of your Celeritas sword sect was also a great grandmaster of the Way of the Sword that surpassed the Shushan Junior Swordsman of the same generation. Do you think that if he knew the truth, would he still go and accept the Shushan sword sect's small kindness that concealed evil intentions?" Sword Venerable Flowing Light's expression was calm. He sighed softly and didn't say anything. Sword Venerable Sunlight said silently, "Perhaps the original intention of the master of the celestial sect was to settle the grudge between Xianmen Tianzong and the Shushan sword sect. However, to us sword cultivators, his contributions will last for generations to come." Sword Venerable Flowing Light, Thunderbolt Sword Venerable, Desolation Sword Venerable, and Star Constellation Sword Venerable all nodded and said in unison, "That's right. Regardless of whether he cares or not, we have all received his kindness." The few great sword cultivators on Jade Capital Mountain avoided the Great Qin Dynasty's southern wisdom monarch Shi Zongtang and the others. However, Shi Zongtang and the others also shook their heads and sighed when they saw them gathered together. The Battle of Shushan and the changes in the weather after the destruction of the immortal heaven, coupled with the explanations of Sword Venerable Sunlight, Sword Venerable Constellation, and Sword Venerable Flying Snow, the Great Qin Dynasty naturally understood the whole story. The relationship between the Great Qin Dynasty and Shushan had never been on good terms. The tranquil monarch Shi Zongyu snorted, coaxing and tricking others into borrowing money from usury. Those who were unwilling were chased out. Those who borrowed money from him, after developing to a certain point, all of their profits were used to support him. They couldn't even back out if they wanted to, unless the entire sect's orthodoxy was destroyed. No wonder the immortal heaven sword was able to recover so quickly after Shushan experienced several great calamities. If not for these great calamities, who knows what the immortal heaven sword would be like now? The southern wisdom monarch Shi Zongtang said. Looking at how Xian Longsheng and the others reacted when the immortal heaven was destroyed, they probably didn't know about it either. It was probably the plan of the ancient and medieval era's helmsman of Shushan. Ren Changmei was only around 3 or 4 generations under him. Shi Zongyu sneered. That's right. Shushan has already become a holy land of swordsmanship. All they have to do is follow the rules. So what if they didn't know about it? Zongtang didn't look at Venerable Swordsman of the Thunderclap and the others. Instead, he looked at Venerable Swordsman of Emerald Wave and the other cultivators of the Songhai sword sect who had come with the Great Zhou dynasty. He saw that although Venerable Swordsman of Emerald Wave and the others had calm expressions, they looked at Yujing Mountain with complicated expressions. Under the guidance of Lin Feng's sect master disciple, Xiao Yan, everyone entered the all-heaven Great Hall to wait. Facing Xiao Yan now, none of the primordial spirit experts, including the Dao integration realm Zongtang, dared to underestimate him. The Xiao Yan before them was no longer just a disciple of Lin Feng's sect master. He was an expert who could stand on equal footing with them. My master will be here in a moment. Please wait for him. Please don't take offense if there is any delay, Xiao Yan said politely. Zongtang and the others shook their heads in understanding and said, "It's fine." The great battle had just ended, so it was normal for Lin Feng to deal with the matters of his sect first. It was not disrespectful. At this moment, Lin Feng was standing on the mysterious heaven treasure tree. He opened his palm, and a grain of sand floated in his palm. Yang Qing knelt before him, while Wang Lin Yuhongyan and Kong Nanhua sighed at the side. Chapter 888. Lin Feng had already listened to Wang Lin and the others' narration of what had happened. At this moment, he was using his divine sense to carefully sense the sand in his hand. A wisp of green smoke was condensed in the sand. It was like a small bug in amber, but also like an undetectable thin thread. After scanning it with his divine sense, Lin Feng muttered to himself, "If that little girl did not kill herself, I could use the bell of creation to manifest the gate of life and death. With the help of the yin and yang life and death formation, and the 3 pages of the Book of Life and Death, even if it was a remnant soul that was refined into a poisonous ghost, it could still be recovered. At that time, I could find a physical body, or even another treasure for her to temporarily live in. Slowly it would be good. But now there's only a remnant soul left. No, it can't even be called a remnant soul anymore. There's only a wisp of energy left. It's going to be extremely difficult to recover. I'm afraid even the Underworld Emperor doesn't have the confidence to do so." Lin Feng thought. Even if she resurrects, there is not much memory and consciousness left. It would be difficult to say that they are the same person. But fortunately, Nanhua was willing to damage her Yuanying to use a secret technique. Otherwise, this trace of remnant soul would not be left. Lin Feng carefully pondered for a moment, and a vague thought appeared in his mind. The success rate is limited. The result is really unpredictable. He flicked his finger, and a half-black, half-white ball of light that looked like a fruit appeared in midair. It was the Netherworld Dao fruit that he had obtained from the Hall Master of the Nether Hall, Su Anda. The Dao fruit did not contain any evil souls. Lin Feng sent the sand into the ball of light, and then the ball of light floated in front of Yang Qing. Lin Feng slowly said, "100 years later, there will be a fortuitous encounter that may allow you to reunite, but your master is only around 50% certain." Although it was a little cruel, Lin Feng still explained everything to Yang Qing. Yang Qing looked at the light in a daze, and then bowed to Lin Feng again. "Thank you, master. Disciple's wish is satisfied to have a glimmer of hope. No matter how bad the situation is, it will not be worse than now." Disciple, on the other hand, has troubled master again. Lin Feng raised his palm in the air, already helping Yang Qing up. "You've confirmed your heart and the path you're going to take in life. I'm happy for you. Walk down this path consistently, always reflect on yourself. I believe that your future is bright." Yang Qing said, "Master, I understand. But before that, follow me to Tianhuang vast land and find Yin Song first," Lin Feng said. Yang Qing nodded. "Yes, master." Looking at Yang Qing, who has a calm and confident temperament, no longer having the inferiority complex and weak air of the past, Lin Feng's mind was also slightly dazed. "You've all grown up, huh?" Yang Qing, the price was too high for her. Thinking of this, Lin Feng glanced at Kong Nanhua. Kong Nanhua's expression was calm, not saying anything. Faced with such a huge blow, with Yangqing's original temperament, she would either make a huge breakthrough and obtain a new life like she was now, or she wouldn't be able to withstand such a huge blow and have her spirit completely collapse, her will completely dispirited. There is a critical point, and the result will be different. Lin Feng suspected that the critical point was the last remnant soul in the sand. If Kong Nanhua was not there to protect Feng Ting's last remnant soul, the result will be different. If Kong Nanhua had not been there to protect the last remnant of Feng Ting's soul, the outcome would have been completely different. But, relaxing his mind, Lin Feng used an action that bystanders could not detect, his gaze moving back and forth between Wang Lin and Yang Qing. This rhythm, it's so weird. Lin Feng muttered in his heart. Can the cursed lone star be contagious or transferred? Dispelling distracting thoughts from his mind, Lin Feng's gaze swept across his disciples. Even though its potential value and not the current value, but as expected, if you encounter a special situation that can only be encountered by luck and not sought after, the potential value will also change. Xiao Yan and the others have changed. Besides Xiao Qing, Hong Yan has changed. Only Yuan Feng and Xiao Wu haven't changed. Is it because the opportunity hasn't come? Lin Feng thought. Yu Hongyan walked forward, holding a green-black halberd in both hands for Lin Feng to deal with. It was the Army Breaker King halberd she got from Zhang Lai. This is your own opportunity, just keep it. Lin Feng smiled slightly. He looked at Yu Hongyan and said, walk your own path, straighten your heart, and you will be enlightened. At this moment, Yu Hongyan had changed a lot compared to the past. Her gaze was much calmer. Previously, the red-haired girl was like a sharp blade that could be drawn at any moment. At the same time, she was also vulnerable to the corrosion of time. However, at this moment, it was as if she had been sheathed. But that didn't mean she was no longer sharp. When it was necessary, she would be even sharper and more intimidating. Yu Hongyan nodded. Holding the spear, she bowed to Lin Feng. I will remember Master's teachings. Lin Feng turned to look at Wang Lin. He smiled. Little Lin, keep this well. Study it carefully. He took out the 3 pages of the Book of Life and Death. He kept half a page for himself, and gave the other 3 pages to Wang Lin. Wang Lin took the page and studied it carefully. His eyes brightened. He looked at Lin Feng. Thank you, Master. Lin Feng said, your underworld pearl has nurtured its original spirit again. It has become a magic treasure again. Although it can't be compared to when it was at the peak of the Mahayana level, it is still a real magic treasure. But because of this, you have to be careful. It's fine if you are on Yujing Mountain or by my side. But if you are traveling alone, you have to be careful of the King of the Underworld and the Book of Life and Death. A cold light flashed in Wang Lin's eyes. He nodded. I understand, Master. A few years ago, after Lin Feng and Su Anda had fought briefly in the Mystic Heaven realm, Lin Feng had told them that the Underworld Pearl originated from the Underworld Devil Sect, a super sect of the Devil Path. It was once the king of the Underworld's orthodoxy. Now that Lin Feng had captured Su Anda, he had a deeper understanding of this. After the king of the Underworld was deposed, he had made arrangements to forcefully reverse life and death. He fell into a state where he was half alive and half dead. Yet neither. He had lived for a long time, waiting for the time to truly be resurrected. During this period, the king of the underworld was not completely unaware of what was happening in the outside world. He had made many preparations in secret. Among them, there were 4 who had secretly inherited his teachings. The eldest disciple was the founding ancestor of the reincarnation sect, the reincarnation Taoist. He had combined the teachings of Buddhism and the king of the underworld to establish the reincarnation sect. He was neither good nor evil, and had always been active in the divine land. Later on, the reincarnation Taoist died in an accident. None of his successors knew about this, and the reincarnation sect fell apart. In recent years, the king of the underworld and Su Anda had secretly invaded the reincarnation sect. The second disciple was the founding ancestor of the underworld devil sect, the Netherworld Taoist. He had perished with the Netherworld Devil sect in the Great War that ended the Middle Era. The third disciple, the Netherworld Taoist, was the most mysterious. His whereabouts were unknown. Even Su Anda only knew that he existed. He had no other information. The last disciple was the master of the underworld hall, Su Anda. However, Su Anda was disloyal and tried to plot against the king of the underworld. He even wanted to take the book of life and death for himself. Unfortunately, the older, the wiser, Su Anda had intended to bury Shi Tianfang in the pit he dug on Yujing Mountain, but Shi Tianfang fell into the pit, and Su Anda himself was kicked into the pit by the underworld emperor, who was even further behind, and was buried together with Shi Tianfang. Wang Lin thought, the book of life and death has refined the 6 paths of reincarnation, and finally achieved creation. If it swallowed the underworld pearl of the Mahayana level, it might be able to improve further. Zhu Yi, Shi Tianhao, and the others walked over. Shi Tianhao gritted his teeth and said, Master, now that you have captured the master of the underworld hall, Su Anda, we can find the lair of the underworld hall now, right? You want to go to the vast land of infinite wilderness to find the old cicada, golden cicada, and Yunsong. We will go to the underworld hall to settle the score. Lin Feng said, A cunning rabbit has 3 burrows. It is not easy to find the underworld hall for it to survive to this day. This time, Su Anda thought he was smart and plotted against Shi Tianfang, but he did not know that he was also in the king of the underworld's trap. When the king of the underworld escaped that day, he knew that Su Anda and Zhang and Rui were in my hands. It is impossible that he did not make preparations. Shi Tianhao gritted his teeth and said, I am just afraid that they will still want to harm my parents and grandfather. Lin Feng smiled and said, Don't worry, he will take the bait himself. There is actually a clue in front of us that we can use. Zhu Yi, Wang Lin, Shi Tianhao, and the others looked at each other with a look of realization in their eyes. Master, you mean? Lin Feng smiled and said, You guys take good care of your vital spirits. After I receive the guests, I will give you some advice. Dao Master Liubo, King Kuei-Nio, and King Sea Spirit Chariot have not seen each other for a long time. Let them have a chat. Dao Master Liubo also wants to join our celestial sect as an offering, and I have already agreed. Xiaoyi, you will arrange a cave residence for him later. After Zhu Yi agreed, Lin Feng looked at Yang Qing and said with a smile, Little Qing, you will need a lot of magic treasures. Yang Qing smiled and said, Master, you must be joking. Lin Feng moved and arrived at the celestial hall. He looked at Shi Zongtang, Dao Master Thundercloud, Sword Venerable of Thunderbolt, Longevity Heavenly Spear, and the others and said, Sorry to keep you waiting. Shi Zongtang and the others said they did not dare. Sword Venerable of Thunderbolt, Sword Venerable of Glorious Sun, and other sword cultivators bowed respectfully to him and said, Thank you, Master of Celestial Sect, for inviting the immortal heaven to perish with a sword from beyond the heavens. Lin Feng looked calm and shook his head. He did not take the credit and said, I have told Dao Master Liu Guang that sending the immortal heaven to perish is to settle the grudge between our sect and Mount Shu. You don't need to thank me. Sword Venerable of Thunderbolt, and the others shook their heads in unison, and bowed to Lin Feng. They did not say anything else, but from their expressions, it was clear that they would remember this favor. Lin Feng sat on the main seat, and looked at the people in front of him. His gaze swept across Sword Venerable of Emerald Wave, King Yanliang of the Great Zhou, Liang Fu, Shen Qifeng, and the others. He said lightly, I am not a bloodthirsty person, so I will not make things difficult for those who have not ascended Yujing Mountain. However, a small punishment is always a warning. You can forget about leaving. Sword Venerable of Emerald Wave, and the others nodded. Liang Fu said, We were impolite in this matter, so we naturally have to express our gratitude. In addition, Sect Master Lin's disciple has reached the primordial spirit realm. The Great Zhou also has a congratulatory gift. Lin Feng nodded slightly and continued, However, anyone who sets foot on Yujing Mountain with ill intentions will have to pay the price. Just stay on the Xiantian God-sealing banner of Xianmen Tianzong. Hearing this, Liang Fu sighed inwardly. He knew that since Lin Feng had said this, he would not go back on his word. Xiao Dongtian and Dao Master Dongming would probably not be able to redeem them. Chapter 889. Liang Fu sighed and made one last effort. East Heaven Gates Master Xiao and Master Dongming, please let them go. The great Zhou dynasty is willing to exchange with a complete medium-class world. Lin Feng calmly glanced at him, lightly saying, the specific details can be discussed between the king of Yan Liang and my head disciple Xiao Yan. But there is no room for compromise on some things. Liang Fu was silent for a moment and finally didn't speak. Songhai Sword Sect's esteemed swordsman Emerald Wave looked at Liang Fu and also didn't speak. After all, Liang Fu was the leader of this trip. Although esteemed swordsman Emerald Sea was captured by Lin Feng, the entire Songhai Sword Sect was grateful for Lin Feng's kindness of cutting the celestial sword. Therefore, their feelings were very complicated and they couldn't express their stance. Esteemed swordsman Emerald Wave and the others were prepared to wait for esteemed swordsman Emerald Sea to come back and discuss together. After that, it was mainly Xiao Yan and Li Yuanfang who would slowly discuss with the other party. Xiao Yan was responsible for demanding an exorbitant price while Li Yuanfang was responsible for discussing them one by one. Esteemed swordsman Fire was captured and the one who came to ransom him was his personal disciple, Yuanying late stage. He was very straightforward and his attitude was very clear. As long as he had it, he would give it whatever he wanted. On one hand, it was because esteemed swordsman Fire was the pillar of the Blaze Sword Sect, and on the other hand, it was also because he was grateful for Lin Feng's kindness of cutting the celestial sword. Shen Qifeng of the Reincarnation Sect was also straightforward and directly expressed that he was willing to pay the Red Lotus Hellfire large amounts of resources and rare treasures, as well as the Reincarnation Sect's power base in 2 medium-class worlds in exchange for the Dark Lord and Wu Xusen. He knew that Xianmen Tianzong's Xiao Yan controlled at least 5 types of true fire, so he directly put the Red Lotus Hellfire on the table. The Empyrean Primordial Spirit Elders had already been trampled to death by Lin Feng, so he simply didn't mention it. Shen Qifeng was very clever. He didn't mention a word about Zhang and Rui and the Sky Ghost Taoist, but he hoped to redeem the Shura Katana. However, this proposal was rejected by Xianmen Tianzong. After realizing that there was no hope of getting Xiao Dongtian and Dongming back, the Great Zhou Empire could only settle for the next best thing. They hoped to get Sword Venerable Vast Sea, and the Eastern Heaven Gate Nascent Divinity Cultivator, who was captured with the Vermilion Heaven Pagoda. At the same time, they hoped to get the Black Heaven Seal, the Vermilion Heaven Pagoda, and other treasures. However, the mysterious Heaven Seal had been seized by Xianmen Tianzong, and there was no possibility of it being returned. It was the same for the Flaming Heaven Divine Cauldron. The sky-piercing jade light needle that had been suppressed along with Dao Sovereign Dongming had also been detained and could not be redeemed. This treasure was the most insidious treasure among the 9 treasures of the heavenly gates. It had killed countless souls. In the past, the Mahayana stage sky-piercing jade light needle had killed a Dao integration stage cultivator on its own. Although it had become a new spirit-nurturing stage treasure, the true meaning of its power was of the same origin as the sky-piercing jade light needle of the past. A sliver of green light specialized in breaking through one's defense and piercing one's soul. It was pervasive yet untraceable. Once it had identified its target, it would follow it relentlessly. This treasure had fallen into the hands of a void return stage cultivator, who was bent on sneak attacks. If used appropriately, it would be a great threat. During the Battle of Jade Capital Mountain, the twin poles of the Heavenly Peak had faced off against Dao Sovereign Dongming and this treasure. Although the twin poles of the Heavenly Peak had been heavily injured, its foundation was still intact. It could still manage to deal with Dao Sovereign Dongming and the sky-piercing jade light needle. Later, Sword Venerable Flowing Light replaced the 2 poles sky peaks and unleashed the speed advantage of his sword Dao to the extreme. To a certain extent, he did not fear or even restrain the sky-piercing jade light needle, which was why he did not cause any trouble. Now, Xianmen Tianzong and Dao Sovereign Flowing Wave, who were at the void return stage, had to be careful when they encountered an enemy of the same cultivation level using this treasure. If they were not careful, they might be injured by the jade light that specialized in breaking through defense. The Flaming Heaven Divine Cauldron, which was also a new treasure, was not allowed to be redeemed. This item looked inconspicuous and was only at the spirit nurturing stage, but it actually had great potential value. On the other hand, the Vermilion Heaven Pagoda, an ancient treasure of the transformation stage, was allowed to be redeemed. This treasure actually had extraordinary functions. Unfortunately, Ind Songchen had revealed his original location after being captured. Although he had moved, Lin Feng's dermic powers and the special effects of the Greenly Jade had led him to a new location. However, Xianmen Tianzong already had the Jade Jing Mountain, which was even more powerful. There was not much use for this item. This time, the other party would definitely be very careful in redeeming it. He would remove all traces, choose a place carefully, and escape into the void again. However, Lin Feng did not care. After having experienced it once, he was confident that he could force the other party out again. At most, if the other party was fully prepared, he would have to spend more effort. However, the Great Zhou Empire and the Eastern Heavenly Gate still had the intention to redeem this treasure. After all, they might face threats that might exist, and Lin Feng was not the only one. Moreover, most of these threats did not have a deep enough friendship to ask Lin Feng to help find the Vermilion Heaven Pagoda. In the end, Xiao Yan asked for an exorbitant price. The Sword Venerable of the Vast Sea, the Eastern Heavenly Gate's primordial spirit embodiment realm cultivator, and the Vermilion Heaven Pagoda were exchanged for the complete medium-class world that the Great Zhou Empire originally planned to use to redeem Xiao Dongtian and the Xiantian Seal. The Great Zhou Empire's East Victory Realm was different from the Reincarnation Sect's two medium-class worlds. The Reincarnation Sect shared those two medium-class worlds with other forces. One of them was the ancient Yuantian realm that Luo Qinggu was born in. The Great Zhou Empire's East Victory Realm was the same as Xianmen Tianzong's Xiantian realm. It was a unique medium-class world with rich resources. Xiao Yan's mouth opened so wide that even the usually good-tempered king of Yanliang, Liang Fu, had the thought of flinging his sleeves and leaving for a moment. It was not easy for him to restrain himself and argue with Xiao Yan and Li Yuanfang. However, as the victorious party, Xiao Yan and the others refused to budge. Liang Fu's bottom line could only be pushed back again and again. In order to not disappoint the other cultivators under the Great Zhou Empire, he and the Great Zhou imperial family had to redeem Sword Venerable of the Vast Sea and the others. More importantly, he had to buy time for the Great Zhou Empire and fight for a relatively loose space for development. It could be imagined that after the Yingxi dispute, the Great Zhou Empire, whose momentum had been interrupted, would be in an even more disadvantageous situation. If they could not fight for time and space to regroup, the situation might even take a sharp turn for the worse. After the Battle of Shu Mountain, the consensus within the Great Zhou Empire was that they should thank Golden Cicada. Because Golden Cicada had kidnapped the direct disciple of Lin Feng, the master of the Mystic Gate, Lin Feng would definitely go to Infinite Wilderness to settle the score and ask for Golden Cicada after solving the problem of the Divine Land. Without this, Xianmen Tianzong would most likely turn his attention to the Great Zhou Empire. Although they might not fight again like in the Battle of Shu Mountain, they were destined to join forces with the Great Qin Empire to further squeeze the Great Zhou Empire's space. With this opportunity, the Great Zhou Empire would have room to ease the relationship between the two sides, or at least to prevent the situation from deteriorating further. Therefore, in the end, Liang Fu could only pinch his nose and accept it. He used the entire East Victory Realm and all the resources in it to exchange for Sword Venerable Vast Sea, and the other two. He also added some treasures to exchange for the other East Heaven Gate disciples who had been captured with the Vermilion Heaven Pagoda. After settling the issue of compensation, Liang Fu and the others also didn't have the face to stay any longer, leaving one by one. On the other hand, before Venerable Swordsman Vast Sea and Venerable Raging Fire left, they instead solemnly bowed towards Lin Feng together. After dealing with the compensation issue, Lin Feng personally thanked Shizongtang and the others for their help. Other than verbal gratitude, Lin Feng was not stingy at all. The East Victory Realm was directly transferred to the Great Qin Dynasty, and the territories that the Reincarnation Sect occupied in the two medium-sized worlds were transferred to Purple Cloud Dao. As for the Northern Militant Imperial Court, They obtained the magic treasure that originally belonged to the East Heaven Gate, the Yantian Divine Cauldron. For the northern militant imperial court, who now occupied the entire northern border and did not lack resources, this treasure complemented each other. It was convenient for the northern militant imperial court to quickly convert resources and increase their strength. The longevity heavenly spear and the northern militant high priest were both pleasantly surprised by this harvest. It was practically scratching the itch in their hearts. If they had to choose from several items of equal value, they would also choose the Yantian Divine Cauldron. As for how to make this magic treasure obedient, that would depend on their own abilities. This was something that should be done. As for the Celeritas Sword Sect, the Thunderbolt Sword Sect, and the Wilderness Sword Sect, Lin Feng naturally expressed his intentions. However, these three clans all insisted on declining, saying that they were ashamed to accept it. After a few refusals, Lin Feng did not push it too far. He said, "This time, the immortal heaven has been destroyed and the truth has been revealed. I know that the few of you have a lot of opinions about Shushan. I believe that Shushan is also aware of this. The few of you can decide for yourselves when you will take the initiative to seek out Shushan. I, Xianmen Tianzong, will definitely not interfere or stop you. If Shushan takes the initiative to find trouble with you, you must let me know." Celeritas Swordsman, Thunderbolt Swordsman, and the others nodded silently and bowed to Lin Feng. "We will remember the righteousness of the master of the Xian sect. However, we owe your sect and you more and more. We cannot repay this favor, but we will obey your orders. You are too kind." Lin Feng waved his hand and said. After thanking them, Lin Feng talked to Shizongtang, Dao Master Thundercloud, High Priest Bei Rong, Celeritas Swordsman, Celeritas Swordsman, Celeritas Swordsman, and the others. It was mainly about the future development of the Divine Land, especially the changes that might happen during Lin Feng's trip to Infinite Wasteland. After sending off Shizongtang and the others, Lin Feng sat in the All Heavens Hall. Other than Xiao Yan and Li Yuanfang, Zhu Yi Wang Lin, and the rest of Xianmen Tianzong's group appeared in front of Lin Feng. "This matter is over. I will prepare to go to Infinite Wasteland now." Lin Feng first looked at Xiao Yan, Zhu Yi, and Yu Hongyan. "Xiao Yan, Xiao Yi, Hongyan, I will leave the mountain this time. You three stay here and contact me if anything happens. I will be back soon. I will leave Yujing Mountain and the Yinyang Life and Death Array. This time, Yujing Mountain will definitely not show up. The will of the Mystic Sky Treasure Tree has returned, and it usually hides in the void. The Yinyang Life and Death Array now has 49 Yinyang dust particles to guard the array core. It can also operate on its own. You don't need to worry about it. In this way, with the three of you and Xiao Yi's Permitha Bridge, there will be no worries in the short term." Xiao Yan was slightly stunned. "Master, your sky-crushing sword, the Bell of Creation, and the sky-crushing sword array have all been sacrificed together. Now you don't even bring the Yinyang Life and Death Array." Lin Feng smiled. "Silly boy, don't worry. I haven't revealed everything in Shu Mountain yet. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.